This is the Sangamon story. Selected readings from Francis Grierson's The Valley of Shadows. I'm your narrator, Kirk Lawhead. Grierson's book chronicles his childhood, growing up on the prairies of Illinois, in the years leading up to the Civil War. It was a volatile region that was neither north nor south, neither for slavery nor against it. His book tells a story of slavery and abolition, and how their small family farm became an unexpected stop on the Underground Railroad. Originally published in 1909, The Valley of Shadows received some critical acclaim, but was quickly forgotten and has fallen into obscurity. Let's begin our journey through the Valley of Shadows. Proem. In the late 1850s, the people of Illinois were being prepared for the new era by a series of scenes and incidents which nothing but the term mystical will fittingly describe. Things came about not so much by preconceived method as by an impelling impulse. The appearance of Uncle Tom's Cabin was not a reason, but an illumination. The founding of the Republican Party was not an act of political wire-pulling, but an inspiration. The great religious revivals and the appearance of two comets were not regarded as coincidences, but accepted as signs of divine preparation and warning. The settlers were hard at work with axe and plow, yet in spite of material preoccupation, all felt the unnameable influence of unfolding destiny. The social cycle, which began with the Declaration of Independence, was drawing to a close, and during Buchanan's administration, the collective consciousness of men, that wonderful prescience of the national soul, became aware of impending innovation and upheaval. It was impossible to tell what a day might bring forth. The morning usually began with new hope and courage, but the evening brought back the old silences, with the old unsolved questionings, strange presentiments, premonitions, sudden alarms. Yet over and around all, a kind of subconscious humor welled up, which kept the mind hopeful while the heart was weary. Dressed in butternut jeans and swinging idly on a gate, many a youth of the time might have been pointed out as a likely senator, poet, general, ambassador, or even president. Never was there more romance in a new country. A great change was coming over the people of the West. They retained all the best characteristics of the Puritans and the settlers of Maryland and Virginia, with something strangely original and characteristic of the time and place, something biblical applied to the circumstances of the hour. Swiftly and silently came the mighty influences. Thousands labored on in silence. Thousands were acting under an imperative spiritual impulse without knowing it. The whole country round about Springfield was being illuminated by the genius of one man, whose influence penetrated all hearts, creeds, parties, and institutions. People were attracted to this region from Kentucky, Missouri, Indiana, the shores of the Ohio, the British Isles, France, and Germany. Other states had their special attractions. Indiana, Kentucky, and Missouri contained hills and forests, appealing to the eye by a large and generous variation of landscape. Iowa and Kansas sloped upward toward the west, giving to the mind an ever-increasing sense of hope and power. To many, Illinois seemed the last and the least, because the most level. Only a poet could feel the charm of her prairies. Only a far-seeing statesman could predict her future greatness. The prairie was a region of expectant watchfulness, and life a perpetual contrast of work and idleness, hope and misgiving. Across its bosom came the covered wagons with their human freight, arriving or departing like ships between the shores of strange, mysterious worlds. The early Jesuit missionaries often spoke of the Illinois prairie as a sea of grass and flowers. A breeze springs up from the shores of old Kentucky, or from across the Mississippi and the plains of Kansas, gathering force as the hours steal on, gradually changing the aspect of nature by an undulating motion of the grass, until the breeze has become a gale, and behold the prairie a rolling sea. The pennant-like blades dip before the storm in low, rushing billows, as of myriads of green birds skimming the surface. The grassy blades bend to the rhythm of nature's music. And when the clouds begin to fleck the far horizon with dim, shifting vapors, shadows, as of long gray wings, swoop down over the prairie, while here and there immense fleeting veils rise and fall and sweep towards the skyline in a vague world of mystery and illusion. The prairies possessed a charm created by beauty instead of awe, for besides the countless wildflowers, they had rivers, creeks, lakes, groves, and wooded strips of country bordering the larger streams. Everywhere, even in the most desolate places, at all times and seasons, signs of life were manifest in the traces, flights, and sounds of animals and birds. Over the snow, when all seemed obliterated, appeared the track of the mink, fox, and chickadee, while during the greater part of the year, the grass, woods, and air were alive with winged creatures that came and went in a perpetual chorus of audible or inaudible song. The prairie was an inspiration, the humble settlers an ever-increasing revelation of human patience and progress. There was a charm in their mode of living, and real romance in all the incidents and events of that wonderful time. Part 1. The Meeting House. All through the winter, the meeting house on Saul's Prairie had stood deserted and dormant, its windows rattling in the bleak winds, perhaps longing for the coming revivals and the living, vital sympathy of beings clothed in garments divine. But now, how different it looked on this wonderful Sunday morning, with its door and windows wide open, the flowers in bloom, and the birds perched on the tallest weeds, pouring forth their song. The fleckless sky and soft, genial atmosphere had made of the desolate little meeting house and its surroundings a place that resembled a second Garden of Eden. How calm and beautiful was the face of nature. The prairie here in Illinois, in the heart of Lincoln's country, had a spirit of its own, unlike that of the forest, and I had come to look upon the meeting house as a place possessing a sort of soul, a personality which made it stand out in my imagination as being unique among all of the meeting houses I had ever seen. It must, I thought, feel the states of the weather and the moods of the people. The settlers made their way to meeting in wagons, on horseback and on foot, and for nearly an hour people straggled in. They came in family groups, and a moment of excitement would be followed by a period of impatient waiting. They came from the west, where a faint column of smoke rose in a zigzag in the warm, limpid atmosphere. From the north, where houses and cabins were hidden in groves or in hollows. From the south, where a forest of old oaks and elms bordered the horizon with a belt of dark green. And from the east, where the rolling prairie spread beyond the limits of vision, a far-reaching vista of grass and flowers. I had arrived early on my pony. Our neighbors would be here, and I should see some of them for the first time. Silas Jordan and his wife Kezia were the first to arrive. He, small, thin, and shriveled, with wiry hair and restless nerves, had a face resembling a spider's web. Crossbars of crow's feet encircled two small, ferret-like eyes sunk deep in their sockets, out of which he peered with eager suspicion at the moving phenomena of the world. She, with that deep glow that belongs to the dusk of certain days in autumn, had jet-black hair, smoothed down till it covered the tops of her ears. Her neck rose in a column from between two drooping shoulders, and her great languid eyes looked out on the world and the people like stars from a saffron sunset. Dark and dreamy, she seemed a living emblem of the tall, dark flowers and the willows that bordered the winding rivers and creeks of the prairies. Then came the Busbys on a horse that carried double. Serena Busby, wearing a new pink calico dress and sunbonnet, the color clashing with her reddish hair and freckled face. When these had settled in their seats, there came one of those half-unearthly spells of silence and waiting, not unlike those moments at a funeral just before the mourners and the minister make their appearance. I had taken a seat inside for a while, but I slipped out again just in time to see a man come loping along on a small, shaggy horse. Man and animal, looking as if they had both grown up on the prairie together. It was Zach Caverly, nicknamed Socrates. Zach was indeed a Socrates of the prairie, as well in looks as in speech, and the person who first called him after the immortal sage had one of those flashes of inspiration that come now and then to the scholar, whose cosmopolitan experience permits him to judge men by a single phrase or gesture. He tied his horse to a hitching post, then stood at the door, waiting to see what new faces would appear at the meeting. Here he met his old acquaintance, Silas Jordan. The talk soon turned to personalities. "Have you heard who them folks is down yonder in the log house?" began Silas, alluding to the new home of my parents. "They're from the old country," Socrates answered, his round eyes blinking in a manner not to be described. "Kinder stuck up for these diggins, I'm a-thinking. I allow they ain't like us folks," was Silas Jordan's careless response. "They had a heap of hired help where they come from. The squire told me hisself what counties he's lived in since he come over from the old country," said Socrates. "He's lived in 2 counties in Missouri, and in 4 counties in Illinois. And now I reckon it's root hog or die as far as these diggins goes. It's his second trial on prairie land. He allows it'll be the last if things don't plow up just as he's set his mind to having 'em. He's a-layin' in with the abolitionists. And he voted once for Abe Lincoln, and he says he're ready to do it again." Socrates looked down the road and exclaimed, "Well, bless my stars, if there ain't Elihu Guest. He's got a stranger with him." When Elihu Guest hitched his horse to the fence, Socrates greeted him. "Howdy, howdy, brother Guest. I were wondering what had become of you. Ain't seen you in a coon's age." Elihu Guest was known as the load-bearer. He had earned this nickname by his constant efforts to assume other people's mental and spiritual burdens. The stranger he brought with him was the preacher. "I were just a-wondering as I come along," said the load-bearer, "what the know-nothings and such like are going to do, seeing as how Lincoln and Douglas are dividing the whole earth atwixt 'em." "Well, Providence created the know-nothings to fill up the chinks," answered Socrates. "And you know it don't no ways matter what you fill 'em up with." "Well, I allow the chinks has to be filled up somehow," replied the load-bearer. "And a log cabin are a mighty good place to live in, when a man's too poor to live in a frame house." "Well, that's it. Them there politicians like Abe Lincoln and Steve Douglas have quit living in log cabins, and there ain't no chinks for the know-nothing party to fill," said Socrates. He had taken out a big jackknife and was whittling a stick. "Appears like there's always 3 kinds of everything. There were the Whigs, the Democrats, and the know-nothings. And there are 3 kinds of folks all over this here country. The Methodists, the hard shells, and them that's soft at feeding time, plumb open for victuals, and dead set agin religion. As I were explaining to Squire Briggs the other day, in the heavens there are the sun, the moon, and the stars. That are 3 kinds again. And where have you ever seen a covered wagon without horses, creatures, and yellow dogs? The yellow dogs are stepping stones to the horses coming in right betwixt the varmints and the human beings, which the Scripture says are just a little below the angels. But you'd never guess without a heap of cute thinking that a yeller dog could make hisself so kind of useful, like as well as particular. As for folks, generally there are 3 kinds: Yankees, niggers, and white people." "You don't calculate to reckon niggers is folks?" ejaculated Silas Jordan. "They are folks just like we are," said the load-bearer, "and they have souls to save. They're being called on, but somehow the slave owners ain't got no ears for the call." "Well," chimed in Socrates, "I ain't agin the abolitionists, and up to now I ain't took much interest in the arguments for and against. I ain't called on for to judge no ways." He looked about him and continued, "They're talking about freeing the niggers. But some of these here settlers ain't got spunk enough to choose their partner for a dance. No oil enough in their joints to bow in a lady's chain. Maybe, after all, the niggers are a sight better off than we are. They ain't got no stakes in the ground." At this point, there was a shuffling of feet and spitting. Then Socrates' thoughts turned to the past. "Before Buchanan's election, I had all the fiddling I could do. But when Pete Cartwright come along, he scared 'em. And when the Baptists come, they doused 'em in poison cold water. And now folks are predicting the end of the world by this here comet. I'll be doggoned if I've drawn the bow once, since folks got scared plumb to their marrow bones. The other night when I heard something snap, I wasn't thinking of the fiddle. And when I took it down the next day just to fondle it a little for old time's sake, I see it were the leading string. And good lasting catgut are scarce as crowing hens in these here parts." Silas Jordan, returning to the subject of my parents, remarked, "I reckon them Britishers at the log house will have to roll up and wade in if they want to get on in this here district." Just then the talk was interrupted by the appearance of the persons in question, and the crowd at the door stared in silence as they walked in. When Silas recovered his wits, he continued his remarks. "She's got on a store bonnet, and he's got on a boiled shirt." To which Socrates replied, without evincing the least surprise, "Tallest man I've seen in these parts except Abe Lincoln." There was a pause, during which the two men gazed through the open door at the tall man who had passed in and taken a seat. There was something strangely foreign and remote in the impression my parents produced at the meeting. My mother wore a black silk gown and a black bonnet with a veil. The tall, straight figure of my father appeared still taller, with his long frock coat and high collar. Although he was still in the prime of life, his serious face and Roman nose gave him something of a patriarchal look. The arrival of the family from the log house caused a flutter of curiosity. But when it was seen that the newcomers were devout worshippers, the congregation began to settle down to a spirit of religious repose. It was a heterogeneous gathering, humorists who were unconscious of their humor, mystics who did not understand their strange, far-reaching power, sentimental dreamers who did their best to live down their emotions, old-timers and cosmopolitans with a marvelous admixture of sense and sentiment, and political prophets who could foresee events by a sudden, illuminating flash, and foretell them in a sudden, pithy sentence. It was a wonderful people, living in a second Canaan, in an age of social change and upheaval, in a period of political and phenomenal wonders. A vague longing filled the hearts of the worshippers. With the doubts and misgivings of the present, there was a feeling that tomorrow would bring the realization of all the yearnings and promises. And when the preacher rose and announced that old wistful hymn, "In the Christian's home in glory, there remains a land of rest," an instant change was produced in the faces of the people. Silas Jordan led the singing in a high, shrill voice, which descended on the meeting like a cold blast through a broken window. Uriah Busby, always on the lookout for squalls, neutralized the rasping sounds by his full, melodious waves. His voice gave forth an unctuous security, not unmixed with a good part of Christian gallantry. In it there was something hearty and fraternal. It leavened conditions and persons, and made the strangers feel at home. If Uriah Busby's singing gave substance to the meeting, that of Kezia Jordan gave expression to its soul. In the second line, her voice rose and fell, like a wave from the infinite depths, with something almost unearthly in its tones, that seemed to bring forth the yearnings of dead generations and the unfulfilled desires of her pioneer parents. A voice had been heard from behind the thin veil that separates the two worlds. My mother felt somewhat timid among so many strangers. As she looked down at the hymn book in her hands, her brows, slightly elevated, gave to her face an expression of pensive reverence. Kezia Jordan had noticed two things about the newcomer: her wonderful complexion and her delicate hands. Kezia had as yet only glanced at the stranger. Had she heard her speak, she would have remembered her voice as an influence going straight to the soul. touching at the heart's secrets without naming them. A voice that enveloped the listener as in a mantle of compassion, with intonations suggestive of unaffected sympathy for all in need of it. My mother had often heard the old Methodist hymns, but now for the first time she felt the difference between the music of a trained choir and the effects produced by the singing of one or two persons, inspired by the spirit of the time, hour, and place. Never had sacred song so moved her. Kezia Jordan had infused into 2 lines something which partook of revelation. The words of the hymn, then, were true, and not a mere juggling with sentiment. Here was an untrained singer who, by an unconscious effort, revealed a truth which came to the listener with the force of inexorable law. For the words, "There remains a land of rest," came as a decree as well as a promise, and my mother now realized what life in the log house would be for her. A glance at the singer confirmed the impression created by her singing. There in Kezia Jordan's strange prophetic features shone the indelible imprints made by the lonely years and the long and silent conflict. There in her eyes shone the immemorial mementos of the ages gone, while the expression of her face changed as the memories came and went like shadows of silent wings over still, clear waters. Prayers had been offered with more or less fervor, and now, with awkward demeanor, the preacher stood up, his pale face and half-scared expression arousing in the minds of many of the people no little curiosity and some apprehension. "Brethren and sistren," he began in a rambling way, "you've all heard the rumors that has been passed from mouth to mouth pertaining to the signs and wonders of these here times. Folks' minds is unsettled. But me and Brother Guest have been wrestling with the spirit all night yonder at his God-fearing home. We were wrestling for a text fitting this here time and meeting. And it warn't till Saturday night morning that Brother Guest opened the good book and, pointing his finger, says, 'I have found it. Hallelujah.' It were Isaiah, 19th chapter, 20th verse. Here the preacher opened the Bible and read slowly, emphasizing certain words so that even the most obtuse present might catch something of the meaning. 'And it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior, and a great one, and he shall deliver them.'" He stopped a moment to let the congregation muse on the text, and then proceeded. "It looked like when he put his finger on that text, Brother Guest were changed as in a twinkling, and our watching and praying were over for that night. Brethren, with the finding of that text, our troubles were gone, and in their place there come to our innermost feelings a bounding joy, such as only them that has faith can know." Here he lost himself. Then, like a drowning man who clutches at a straw, he seized hold of an old hackneyed text, the first that came into his mind, and he continued regardless of the consequences. "For as the Scripture says, what came ye out for to see? A reed shaken by the wind? I allow most ye has plenty reeds if ye anywheres near Snipe district, but I reckon ye ain't troubled much by seeing 'em shake." He began to regain confidence, and leaving reeds, he grappled with the earth and the heavens in periods which carried everybody with him. "But there ain't a sinner here, there ain't no Christian here today that weren't plumb shook up by that earthquake the other night that rocked ye in your beds like you were being rocked in a skiff in the waves behind one of them Mississippi stern-wheelers. No, brethren, the Lord has passed the time when he shakes your cornfields and your haystacks by a little puff of wind. He has opened the roof of heaven so you can all see what's a-comin'. He has made it so all of you, except them that's blind, can say truly, 'I have seen it.' Under you, the earth has been shook. Over you, the stars are beginning to shift and wander. A bosom of destruction will overtake them that's on the wrong side in this here fight." He eyed the people up and down on each side, and then went on. But the text says he shall send them a Savior, and a great one, and he shall deliver them. Now it are just as plain as the noonday sun that the Lord God appoints his own leaders, and it are just as plain that his choice ain't fell on no shuffling backslider. You can bet all your land and your cattle and your horses on this one preposition, and that is you can't get away from facts by no cross arguments that many are called but mighty few are chosen. And that means that only one man is appointed to lead. At this, there was a visible change in the attitude of many of the listeners. "What are he a-comin' to?" whispered old Lem Stevens to Uriah Busby. It was a bold stroke, but Elihu Guest, the load-bearer, had won over the preacher to speak out, and he was coming to the main point as fast as an artless art and blunt but effective rhetoric would let him. He proceeded with his sermon, now bringing the expectant people to the verge of the last period, now letting them slip back as if he were giving them a breathing spell to brace them for a still stronger stage in the argument. It was wonderful how this simple preacher, without education or training, managed to keep the interest of the congregation at boiling point for more than an hour before he had pronounced the two magical words that would unlock the whole mystery of the discourse. Before him sat old Whigs, Know-Nothings and Democrats, Republicans, militant abolitionists, and outspoken friends of slave owners in the South. But the load-bearer was there, his eyes riveted on the speaker, every nerve strung to the utmost pitch, assuming by moral compact the actual responsibility for the sermon. If the preacher failed, Elihu Guest would assume his loads. If the sermon was a triumph, he would share in the preacher's triumph. As the sermon drew to a close, it became evident that by some queer roundabout way, by some process of reasoning and persuasion that grew upon the people like a spell, they were listening and had all along been listening to a philippic against slavery. At last, the preacher's face lost its timorous look. With great vehemence, he repeated the last part of his text. "For they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior, and a great one, and he shall deliver them." There was a moment of bewilderment and suspense, during which Lem Stevens was preparing for the worst. His mouth, usually compressed to a thin, straight slit, was now stiffened by a bulldog jaw, which he forced forward till the upper lip had almost disappeared. Minerva Wagner sat rigid, her mummy-like figure encased in whalebone, wrapped in linsey-woolsey. The preacher gave them no rest. "Now right here I want you all to ask yourselves, who it are that's a-crying for deliverance? Who are it? Why, there ain't but one people a-crying for deliverance, and they are the slaves down there in Egypt." The words fell like a muffled blow in the silence. Lem Stevens sat forward breathless. Uriah Busby heaved a long sigh. Fire flashed from Minerva Wagner's gray, faded eyes. Ebenezer Hicks turned in his seat, his bushy eyebrows lowering to a threatening frown, while the face of Socrates wore a look of calm and neutral curiosity. But hardly had the meeting realized the full force of the last words when the preacher put the final questions. "And who shall deliver them? Do any of you know? Brethren, there ain't but one human creature equal to it, and that Abraham Lincoln. The Lord has called him." An electrical thrill passed through the meeting. A subtle, permeating power took possession of the congregation. For the preacher had pronounced the first half of the name Abraham in such a way that it seemed as if the patriarch of Israel was coming once more in person to lead the people. An extraordinary influence had been evoked. A living investment of might and mystery, never at any time very distant, was now close at hand. Ebenezer Hicks rose, and casting a fierce glance about him, hurried out. Minerva Wagner sprang from her seat like an automaton, suddenly moved by some invisible force, and left the meeting, followed by her two lank sons. Lem Stevens hurried after them, and with each step gave vent to his feelings by a loud thump on the bare floor with his wooden leg. When he got to the door, he cast one last withering look at the preacher. But Uriah Busby's voice rang out loud and sonorous. "How tedious and tasteless the hours when Jesus no longer I see." The old hymn was taken up by Kezia Jordan in the next line. Once more her voice filled the meeting house with golden waves. Once more every heart beat in unison, and every soul communed in an indescribable outpouring of religious melody. The whole congregation was singing now. With Keziah's voice, a balm of Gilead came pouring over the troubled waters created by the strange, prophetic, and menacing sermon. The load-bearer, with hardly voice enough to speak aloud, was singing. The preacher sang even louder than he had preached. Serena Busby sang as I had never heard her sing again. And while those who had left the meeting were about to depart, they heard what they would never hear repeated. The opportunity to join hands with the coming hour had passed, and as they set out for home, they must have been haunted by the matchless magic and simplicity of the words and music, and more than ever would the coming hours seem tedious and tasteless to them. Part 2. The Load-Bearer. We had been 4 months in the log house, and my mother was just beginning to feel at home, when one afternoon, as I was sauntering along the road near the gate, I saw a man on foot coming from the south. As he approached, I noticed that his features had a peculiar cast. His hair was rather long, his movements somewhat slow, and when he arrived in front of the gate, he squared about and stopped with a sort of jerk, as if he had been dreaming, but was now awake and conscious that this was the place he had come to visit. He peered at the log house as though awaiting some interior impulse to move him to further action. Then he opened the gate, and walking through the yard to the front door, rapped lightly. I had followed him in, and when my mother opened the door, the stranger said in a listless sort of way, "I just called to see how you're getting on." I saw it was Elihu Guest, the load-bearer. My mother thanked him, invited him in, and offered him a chair. "I allow you're not long settled in this here section," he said, taking a seat. "Not long," she answered. "We are quite settled in the house, but on the farm my husband has so much to do he hardly knows where to begin." She placed the kettle on the stove for coffee and busied herself about getting the strange visitor some substantial refreshment. I thought I had never seen a face more inscrutable. He eyed my mother with grave interest, and after a silence that lasted some considerable time, he said, "If your loads is too heavy, just cast 'em off. The Lord is willin', and I ain't no ways contrary." Not till now did she realize that this was the man she had heard so much about, but not knowing what to say, she gave no answer. As he sat and stared at my mother, his presence diffused a mysterious influence. My mind was busy with queries. Who sent him? What are his loads? Why does he take such an interest in my mother? And I thought she must be giving him coffee and eatables, the better to enable him to support his loads, whatever they might be. She placed the coffee and other good things on the table, and cordially invited the stranger to make himself at home. After pouring out a cup of coffee, she sat down with folded hands, her pale face more pensive than usual, making some remarks about the weather and the good prospects for the new settlers. Elihu Guest sat, a veritable sphinx of the prairie, wrapped in his own meditations. She almost feared that his visit might be a portent of some coming calamity, and that he had come to warn her and help her to gather force and courage for the ordeal. Yet there was something in his look which inspired confidence and even cheerfulness, and she concluded it was good to have him sitting there. He began to sip his coffee, and at last, as if waking from a reverie, he put the question, "How are you feeling in spirit?" "The Lord has been merciful," she replied, the question having come as an immediate challenge to her religious faith and courage. "Your coffee is most appetizing," he said with a slight sniff. "I'm glad you like it, and I hope you're feeling rested, for you seem to have come a long way." "Well, there's a powerful difference atwixt a mile and what a man's thinking. When your mind is set on one thing, the distance atwixt two places ain't much no ways." "Do you always walk?" "It's according to how the horse is feeling. If the beast is anyways contrary, he gives a snort as much to say, 'Maybe I'll carry you, maybe I won't.' But when he snorts and kicks both at once, that means he'll kick the hind sights off all creation if I try to ride him. I've seen him when Joshua and his trumpet couldn't get him out in the barn door. I don't believe in working dumb critters when their spirits are drooping. I'm always more contented when I'm obliged to walk, and horses are powerful scarce. Necessity compels us to do many things that seem impossible, but we learn to accept them as the best things for us. Won't you have some more coffee? Your coffee is most appetizing, it is so. And won't you eat something? I'm much obliged, but I don't feel no craving for victuals. According to Sister Jordan, your cakes and pies beat all she ever see. Mrs. Jordan is a very good woman. She is so. I've known her from away back. There came another pause, during which the visitor looked straight before him, lost in thought. That comet's convicted a good many folks. Ebenezer Hicks was scared half to death when he see it a-comin', making the loads most heavy for his poor wife. Then addressing my mother, he continued, The night he were afflicted, I couldn't get to sleep nohow. I says to myself, There's an axle tree wants oilin', and I'll be blamed if it ain't over to Ebenezer Hicks's. I went to the barn to see how the horse were feelin', and I says, Can you carry me over to Ebenezer Hicks's if I saddle you? But Henry Clay give a kick that set me to wondering how I were ever going to get there. Many people think the end of the world is at hand. They do for a fact. But them that's scared are folks without faith. I ain't got no call to take loads from folks what's scared. Somehow I can't carry 'em. The burdens of life are indeed hard to bear alone. They are so. And atwixt you and me, Mom, I'm just a mite uncertain about what it are that afflicts some folks. 'Pears like Satan scares more folks than is ever won over by the Lord's goodness and mercy. Them that's always a-tremblin' ain't much account when it comes to strapping the belly band real hard. They don't never sit tight in the saddle when they're called on to go plumb through a wilderness of thistles. But Ebenezer Hicks, he warn't a-patchin' on Uriah Busby, what lives yonder at Black Bear Creek. He was so scared, he set to weepin' when he seen me come in. And I never see a woman as hoppin' mad as Sereny Busby. I couldn't take no loads from Brother Busby. According to my notion, he wa'n't sittin' up under none. And just as soon as I sot eyes on Sister Busby, I see she hadn't hitched up to nothing of any heft neither. She don't set still long enough. I allow I was some disappointed. He laughed faintly. Perhaps he wished to convey the impression that the burdens of life were not so dreadful after all. I fear you had your trouble all for nothing. You see, Brother Busby was scared, and Sister Busby got a dander up. I never knowed a woman with red hair that were afeard of man or beast. Mr. Busby must have been very much frightened. Not so scared but what he could talk. Si Jordan had his speech took plumb away, and I never see Sister Jordan so flustered. But she don't say much nohow. Sereny Busby, she keeps the top a spinning the livelong day. But I've seen Uriah Busby caved in more'n once. I knowed 'em both afore they were married. If I wanted a woman sprightly with her tongue as well as with her hands, I'd take Sereny Busby for first choice. If I wanted a woman what knows a heap and says most nothing, I'd take Kezia Jordan. Human nature ain't always the same. I allow Sister Busby's got the most education. But education never helps much if the heart is not in the right place. That's what I've always said. Appears like sometimes Sereny Busby's heart is just a leetle lopsided and wants resetting, as you might say. But there's a sight of difference atwixt one load and another. When I set with some folks what's in a heap of trouble, I go away as happy as can be. But when I have to go away without nary a load, I feel most empty. Here there was another spell of silence, but after a few sips from a third cup of coffee, the load-bearer continued. Appears like there wa'n't never no heft to Sereny Busby's problems. She don't give 'em no chance to set. And just as a duck's back goes against water, hers is set against loads. The Lord has given her a cheerful mind, and I think she has much to be thankful for. She has for a fact. But I can never tell just how her mind is a-workin'. She steps around as spry as can be, hummin' fiddle tunes mostly, And when Brother Busby took to bed with that fever what most killed him, she kept on a-hummin'. Some folks would have said she were triflin', but she weren't. She give Uriah his medicine most regular, and mopped his head with cold water from the well, and made him appetizin' rabbit soup. The Bible says the spirit's willin', but the flesh is weak. But I don't see no failin' in a woman that can hum all day like a spinning top. But I can always tell what Kezia Jordan is a-thinkin', and there ain't no two ways about it. Sister Jordan can sing hymns so you want to give right up and die, you feel so happy. She has something wonderful in her voice when she sings. I felt that when I heard her sing in meeting. I allow Cy Jordan ain't particular benevolent, but Kezia Jordan counts for more than one in that there house. I fear she's had a life of much care and trouble, and perhaps that is one reason why she is so good. Folks is born like we find 'em, Mom. I've been nigh on 30 years wrestling with the sorrows of life, and I ain't nary seen a critter will change his spots. A wolf don't look like a wildcat, and I never see a fox with a bobbed tail. And folks are like varmints. God Almighty has marked 'em with his seal. He looked around the room abstractedly, and then said, "It's looks that tells when a man's in trouble, and a heap of tribulation keeps folks from hollerin'. Sister Jordan has known trouble from away back, but there's a tremendous difference betwixt her and Cy Jordan. He can talk and pray when he gets a-goin', and I've heard him when it looks like a flow of words would swamp the whole endurin' meetin'. But when the risin' settled, there wasn't much harm done no way. But just let Sister Jordan sing a hymn, and you feel like the whole earth was set in tune. That's because she is so sincere. Why, that's a fact. And I ain't never forgot the time when I had that spell of sickness, and felt as if there wasn't nothing worth a livin' for. What with sickness, and the defeat of Fremont, and them desperadoes cutting up over in Kansas, and the goings-on of them Democrats in Springfield, it appeared like I would never be good for nothing more. All to once the feeling come over me to go over to Kezia Jordan's. That'd be about as much as I could do, seeing I were like a chicken what's just pecked its way through the shell. I hadn't got as far as the kitchen door when I heard her a-singin', "Come, thou fount of every blessin', tune thy heart to sing thy praise." That voice of hers set me a-cryin', and I sat right down on the doorsteps and thanked God for all his goodness. After a while, she come out for a bucket of water. "Good land," she says, "I'm right glad to see you. Go right in. You're just in time for dinner. I got some real nice prairie chicken and pumpkin pie. Everything's almost ready." Soon as I went in, she says, "Mercy on us, Elihu, I never see you look so. Set right down and tell me what ails you. You ain't been sick without letting me know, have you?" I like to have a good Christian for my nearest neighbor. I allow she weren't always a Christian. I were over at Carlinville when she heard Pete Cartwright for the first time, and the meeting house weren't big enough to hold the people. Sister Jordan weren't moved to sing any during the first hymn, but she joined in the second, and after that, Brother Cartwright took right a hold, as you might say, and swung 'em till their feet touched perdition. "You're ripe," he says, holding out his fist. "You're ripe like grain waiting for the reaper. You'll be mowed down, and the grain will be plumb divided from the chaff, and the Christians will be parted from the sinners." The whole meeting began to move like wheat a-waving in the wind. The preacher knowed Kezia Jordan for a natural-born Christian by her singing, for he pointed straight and says, "You're at the crossroads, sister. You'll have to choose one or the other, and the years and the months are gone for most of you, and there's only this here hour left for to choose. Which will it be? Will it be the road that leads up yonder, or the one that leads down by the dark river, where the willows are a-weepin' night and day?" This was a turning point for a good many, but the preacher wasn't satisfied yet. He rolled up and went to work in dead earnest. He told about the first coon hunt he ever see. "Sinners," he says, "is just like the coon asleep in that tree, never dreamin' of danger. But the varmint were waked all of a sudden by a thunderin' smell of smoke and had to take to the branches. Someone climbs up the tree and shakes the branch where the coon is holding on, And right here, Pete Cartwright slung his handkerchief over his left arm and says, "A little more, a little more, a little more." And the varmint's bound to drop square on the dogs. He shook his arm 3 times. "Down, down, down," he says, letting the handkerchief drop down to where the wailing and gnashing are 1,000,000 times more terrible than the suffering of that coon. The load-bearer bent forward, and his face assumed a look of tragic intensity as he continued. "A veil of mourning were being pulled down over the meeting. He were taking the people straight to judgment, like a flock of sheep, with the goats a-following, using no dividing line. For he put it to 'em, where would you all be if this here floor were to slide right from under you, leaving you sitting on the brink, with time on one side and eternity on the other?" The whole meeting was shook to pieces, some hollering, some too afflicted to set up, and I see nigh on 20 plumb fainted and gone. The load-bearer sighed as he sat back in his chair and proceeded in his usual way. When the meeting were over, I says to Sister Jordan, "How are you feeling in spirit?" And she says, "I've had more than enough of this world's goods." "I want to know," says I. "Yes," she says, "I don't never want no more, and I see it were for everlasting." No one spoke for a long time. At last he rose from his chair and moved towards the door like one in a dream, his face wearing a look of almost superhuman detachment. Then, just before passing out, he turned and said, "I'll bid you good day for the present." This visit made the day a memorable one for me, for I saw in Elihu-Guest a human wonder. He opened up a world of things and influences about which I had never dreamed, and when he disappeared down the road to the south, the way he had come, I wondered how he was carrying his loads, what they could be, and whether my mother felt relieved of any of her burdens. But I held my peace while she simply remarked, "A very strange but very good man. I wonder if we shall ever see him again." Here was a man who did everything by signs, tokens, impressions, who was moved by some power hidden from the understanding of everyone else, a power which none could define, concerning which people had long since ceased to question. He came and went, influenced by signs, in harmony with his own feelings and moods, by natural laws, shut off from our understanding by the imperative rules of conventional religion and society. Things which were sealed mysteries to us were fingerposts to him, pointing the way across the prairies, in this direction or in that. Is it time to go forth? He would look up at the heavens, sense the state of nature by the touch of the breeze, sound the humor of the hour with a plumb line of his own, then set out to follow where it led. The load-bearer's presence, his odd appearance, his description and peculiar phrases, his spells of silence, his sudden enthusiasms, the paradox of humor and religious feeling displayed, brought to our home the fervor and candor of the meeting-house, honest pioneer courage and frankness, and above all, an influence that left on me an impression never to be effaced. How far, how very far we were from the Episcopal rector with his chosen words, studied phrases, and polite and dignified sympathy. How far it all was from anything my parents had ever dreamed of, even in so remote a country. The prairie was inhabited by a people as new and strange as the country itself. And what a gulf there was between the customs of the old country and the customs usual in the New West. Visitors appeared unannounced, and at almost any hour. Today, a neighbor would come 2 miles to borrow some sugar. Tomorrow, another would come still further to borrow tea or coffee. All were received as if they were old and tried friends. My mother attended to the wants of those who came to borrow things for the table, while my father did his best to satisfy the men who came to borrow plows, spades, saws, wagons, and even horses. For the neighbors considered my father a rich man, judging him by the horses, sheep, and cattle he owned. And when he appeared at meetings, wearing a handsome velvet waistcoat with rich blue checks, one of the waistcoats he purchased during his visit to Paris before his marriage, they thought him richer still. Thus are appearances even more deceptive and dangerous than words, for all, without exception, are judged by the illusions produced by property and personal attire. Part 3. Silas Jordan's Illness. The solemn hush of the wilderness had its voices of bird and insect, wind, rain, and rustling grass. But from the song of the birds and grasshoppers to the noiseless march of the comet was a far and terrible cry, and more than one head of a family, seeing its approach nearer and nearer to the earth, sat with folded hands awaiting the end. While it frightened some into silence, it made others loquacious, while others again could not help laughing at the comical figure some of the frightened ones assumed. No sooner did Silas Jordan see the comet than a great fear seized him, and he sat down in the kitchen, a millstone of desolation holding him in his seat. Hardly a day passed that I did not run up to the Jordans, and on this evening, instead of hearing Mrs. Jordan singing one of her favorite hymns, I listened to a monologue which contained a note of sadness. When Kezia came in with a chicken, which she had just killed and was about to scald and pluck, a glance at her husband told her of the great and sudden change. "Dear me, sus, Zach Cavalier said you'd be apt to feel a touch of fever when you broke that piece of land down by the log house." She expected an answer, but none came, and she went on. "I don't know what we'll do with so much work waiting to be done." She took from the highest shelf in the cupboard a large box of quinine pills and offered Silas 2, but he refused them with a stubborn shake of the head. Mrs. Jordan put the box aside and began to pluck the chicken with a will that might have inspired her husband with courage had he noticed what she was doing. "It ain't no use giving way and brooding over your feelings," she said quietly. Alec came in and told his mother a comet was to be seen, and she stepped to the door to look. She had heard the rumors and prophecies, but they left her indifferent. Her deep religious faith made it impossible for her to worry when worry seemed almost a sin, and it never occurred to her that Silas was not ill of malaria, but of fear and despair. "Pap's ailin'," said Alec. "If he ain't no better tomorrow, I'll go for that yerb doctor that cured Ebenezer Hicks of them faintin' spells." He had a horror of long illnesses, and would call in a doctor at the slightest sign of a break-up in health. The next day I was at the Jordan home again, this time with tempting edibles for the invalid, who, however, refused everything. The doctor arrived shortly after. Then, on his heels, came Socrates, who, when he saw the doctor's horse and saddlebags, guessed there was something wrong with the Jordan household. The doctor was looking about the room like a rabbit let loose in a strange place. Lank and bony, clothed in blue jeans, he looked a picture of unsophisticated ignorance. "My husband's ailin'," said Mrs. Jordan, as she took a chair and placed it before Silas for the doctor. "How long's he been feelin' this-a-way?" he asked in a drawling voice as he sat down and took hold of the patient's lip hand. "Since yesterday. Chills and fevers, I reckon," he said, looking at Silas with a blank stare. "He ain't had any chills," returned Mrs. Jordan. "Ain't had no pin-feather feelin's?" "I don't reckon he has." "No chattering of the teeth?" "Not as I know of." "Been wandering in his mind?" "Not as I know of." "Ain't felt overly het up?" "I guess not." "Then I reckon it's dumb ague," concluded the doctor at his wit's end. "I guess it is," said Kezia, "for he ain't spoke a word since he was took." The doctor now asked to see the patient's tongue, and after much persuasion, Silas slowly put out the tip, then closed his jaws with a smart snap. "Mighty peart for a man what can't talk," observed Zach Cavalier. But the doctor, more and more bewildered, simply nodded his head, and then moved his chair back several paces, as if to be well out of the reach of a patient who might suddenly do him an injury. He looked fixedly at the little wiry-faced man, not knowing what to say or do. Suddenly a thought struck him. "Has he ever had any queer ideas?" "I don't know that he has," replied Kezia, "except he's been figuring on just how long it would take to buy out the folks at the big log house." "And you say he ain't et no victuals since yesterday?" "Not a morsel." The doctor considered for a while, pulled at his goatee, and said, "I allow his symptomania are somewhat confounding. But just at this particular point where, as you might say, The fever has kind of thawed out the chills, and the chills has sort of nipped the fever in the bud. Both of 'em been driving. They're a-fighting it out on the liver, and a man ain't calculated to know just how things are working up on the inside." "Will it last long?" demanded Alec. "Well, there ain't no cause to be frustrated. The other day I see a man over Bear Creek way that rolled on the floor for nigh an hour, and I'm doggone if the chills and fever didn't stay right where they were. His wife allowed I give him too much senna and calomel, but it takes a powerful sight to make him go different ways, more particular when the chills are dumb." The doctor, after ordering huge doses of calomel and quinine, shuffled awkwardly out, and Socrates took Silas Jordan's hand and considered for a moment. Then, looking about the room, he observed, "If chills means being cold, he ain't got no chills. And if fever means being hot, he ain't got no fever." "What has he then?" inquired Alec with a startled look. "I want to know," exclaimed Kezia, rising to face the new situation. "He's got the funks." Alec, appalled at the sound of a word he had never heard till now, gasped out, "Is it catchin'?" "Catchin'? I'd like to see you catch a weasel in a haystack," observed Socrates. Mrs. Jordan looked at one and then at the other, but before she had time to say anything further, in came Uriah Busby. He had come in a great hurry. Of middle age, somewhat portly and slightly bald, he now looked 10 years older than when I saw him at the meeting house. Today his face wore a haggard and woebegone expression. He had come to find out what his practical, cool-headed neighbor, Silas Jordan, thought of the comet. "Glad to see you," was Kezia's gentle greeting. She handed him a chair, and Uriah sat down, heaved a deep sigh, and began to wipe his perspiring head and face with his big handkerchief. "No," resumed Socrates, where he had left off, "he ain't sick. He's only scared." Uriah Busby could hardly believe his ears. He had come thinking that Silas Jordan would have some counsel of hope to offer, and there he sat, scared into helplessness. Nevertheless, Uriah felt called upon to say something. "These be times of great affliction. It looks like the preacher were plumb right, and the Lord's hand is stretched agin us." "Maybe you're right," interrupted Socrates, "but as far as I can see, the Lord ain't touched any of you with more'n a thumb and forefinger." The eyes of the invalid were now wide open. He sat bolt upright, as if shaking off the effects of a horrid nightmare, and blurted out, "After all, like as not, it ain't a-comin' our way." Uriah Busby pointed upward, his voice tremulous with emotion. "Maybe it's only a sign of grace for the elect." But Socrates simply remarked, "It's a sign you've been sitting on a chinny egg like a wet hen, and it's about time you were up and dustin'." Kezia's dark face was all aglow. She looked as if she had no words to express what she felt. Uriah Busby's confusion increased with every remark that came from Socrates, who seemed to expose everyone's secret. "It's just as you say," he stammered at last. "If the Lord's willin', it's our duty to work and not to sit waitin'." "And he's been sittin' there ever since he was took," said Mrs. Jordan. "Appears you'll like to have to pull him up like you would a Jimson weed," added Socrates. "Maybe that medicine man has got more sense than I allowed he had. Maybe it's like as not, Si needs a thunderin' big shakin', and if we'll just set to work, we can bring him to rights. Did you ever see a bear come out after the first big thaw, hopping around on two legs this-a-way, getting his sinews sort of stretched out and his blood sort of warmed up?" He began to imitate a dancing bear, stepping first on one leg, then on the other, swaying, nodding, and bending his head, with comical glances at Silas. "Do like Mr. Bear! Shake yourself!" And with this, Socrates pulled the invalid out of his seat with a sudden jerk, forcing him round and round, dancing, bending, and hopping, with growls and grimaces to harmonize with his Bruin-like antics. "Keep it up!" shouted Uriah Busby. "It'll do him a heap of good." Socrates kept up the hopping and swaying until Silas Jordan was exhausted, and Alec's fear had changed into a broad grin that was almost laughter. and hardly had the mad dance ceased when Silas asked for fried chicken, the chicken which Kezia had killed and dressed, and kept waiting for some such occasion. "The ways of the Lord are past finding out," remarked Uriah, wiping his face. When the chicken was ready, Silas walked about picking a wing which he held in both hands. "He's as hungry as a wolf, I do declare," said Kezia in a half-whisper as she went about her duties, relieved of the long strain of watching and waiting. Then she added, "I never see his equal." "I allow you never did, Sister Jordan," rejoined Socrates, "but you're mistaken in the varmint. You mean he's as hungry as a catamount." Part 4. The Cabin of Socrates. "Sonny," said my father one afternoon, "you can come with me and you will have a chance of seeing Socrates, for I am to call at his cabin to see a drover on some business." I accepted the invitation with joy, for I never tired of hearing Zach Caverly talk. Even to sit and look at him was to me a great treat. Socrates was sitting at his cabin door, smoking, dreaming, and listening to what strange sounds might reach him from the woods. As he sat there, he felt himself detached from the world, yet near enough to human beings to have all the society he desired. He thought of the new settlers, their troubles and vexations, and he wondered how many of them were as free from care as himself. Under the cabin the hounds were sleeping, all cuddled up. And now, after a somewhat busy and exciting day, nature seemed more intimate and satisfying than ever. Age brought with it less and less ambition, less and less desire to do useless things, to speculate about vain theories and impending political events. To the mind of Socrates, worry and ambition were unnatural and foolish things, and eternity meant today. As he sat at his door, he felt at home in the universe. The wilderness was his kingdom, his subjects the birds and beast, his friends the hound and his rifle. And he rode out among the settlers like a king on a tour of inspection, with advice here and a greeting of encouragement where it was needed. And when he returned to his cabin, peace and contentment issued forth from every log. His cabin was his palace. A huge stag's head nailed over the entrance might have been taken for a coat of arms in the rough, while inside another set of antlers adorned the chimney place. From the rafters hung the pelt of fox and wildcat. A low couch was covered with a buffalo robe, and on the floor were some old skins of the black bear. Several trophies of the wolf were stretched on nails, and strings of Indian corn hanging about here and there made the inside of the cabin a picture of indolence and activity. Zach Caverly was the last of his peculiar mode of life in this part of the country, and towns and railroads would soon put an end to such a mode of living. The cabin adjoined a deep wood not far from a creek, with the prairie in front, and from his door not a house could be seen. Socrates had been here some 25 years, and knew the history of every family within a radius of many miles, their peculiarities, virtues, and vices. He could sum up the powers and failings of a newcomer at a glance. As for himself, he knew where his food would come from for a year, good weather or bad. He knew the work required at his hands, using his own time and pleasure in doing it. For often, when the weather was fine and the ground dry, he would spend whole days hunting in the bottoms, many miles from home. He plowed when it suited him and reaped much in the same way. He read no books, did not belong to any religious sect, never had been to school, and owing to his wanderings in his younger days, had no prejudices. He knew the haunts and habits of all the animals and birds of field and forest, and the time to expect certain wildflowers, and he had his own weather signs. He loved everything wild, regarding his solitary mode of life as the most natural thing in the world. As the days and hours came and went, so he passed from one mood to another without being conscious of any change, without grief or regret, rising in the morning and lying down at night with the same feeling of security and contentment. And principally for this reason, he was welcomed everywhere, bringing with him an atmosphere of mental vigor and confidence at a time when these forces were so much needed. His mind was on the present, thus no time was lost in idle sorrow for events of yesterday. It was nearly dusk when we arrived at the cabin, and my father had not long to wait for the drover. Soon after, Socrates set about getting us a supper of bacon, eggs, hoe cakes, and coffee, which we ate with keen appetites. Shortly after supper was over, Elihu Guest, the load-bearer, came driving up and hitched his team to one of the logs near the door. He was on his way home from the post office. "I were kind of moved to come around and see you," he said. "Right glad you come. You're always welcome as long as I'm alive and kicking," answered Socrates with his usual good humor. "The feeling come just as I got to the crossroads there by Ebenezer Hicks's cornfield." Just then Lem Stevens rode up. Socrates had come out to greet the load-bearer, and the three men sat down on the logs while I sat at one side. My father and the drover were inside discussing some matters of business. But oh, how shall I depict the company outside? The objects fading in the deepening dusk, the stars growing brighter every moment, the stillness broken now and again by the cries of the whippoorwill and the conversation of the three men. After a long spell of cloudy weather, the sky had cleared, the air was warm and dry, and when the darkness closed in, the night came with a revelation. Never in that region had such a night been seen by living man, for a comet hung suspended in the shimmering vault, like an immense silver arrow, dominating the world and all the constellations. An unparalleled radiance illumined the prairie in front of the cabin. The atmosphere vibrated with a strange, mysterious glow, and as the eye looked upward, it seemed as if the earth was moving slowly towards the stars. The sky resembled a phantasmagoria seen from the summit of some far and fabulous Eden. The Milky Way spread across the zenith like a confluence of celestial altars, flecked with myriads of gleaming tapers, and countless orbs rose out of the luminous veil like fleecy spires, tipped with the blaze of opal and sapphire. The great stellar clusters appeared like beacons on the shores of infinite worlds, and night was the window from which the soul looked out on eternity. The august splendor of the heavens, the atmosphere, palpitating with the presence of the all-ruling spirit, diffused a feeling of an inscrutable power reaching out from the starry depths, enveloping the whole world in mystery. I sat and gazed in awe and silence. Socrates was quietly smoking a corncob pipe, while Elihu Guest, wrapped in wonder, contemplated the heavens, as if seeking an answer to his innermost thoughts. "I knowed we were close to it," exclaimed the load-bearer at last, referring to the comet. "The hand of the Lord are pointing straight." He stopped to meditate again, and no one broke the silence for some little time. Then he proceeded. "I've seen it afore, but never like this. Appears like over and around here the whole heavens are clearer, and the stars look like they were near the earth." "Be you on rising ground?" asked Lem Stevens, addressing Socrates. "Not unless it's risen since we've been sitting here." "I allowed you weren't," said Lem, "but maybe I thought I were mistaken." "It's the feelin's a man has when miracles are a-being worked," said the load-bearer with familiar confidence. "A man's thoughts and feelin's ain't no ways the same when the Lord begins to manifest his power. He ain't afeard to show his hand, but I ain't never seen a card player let you look at his cards." "Because it are we uns that do the shufflin'," observed Socrates. "Providence allus leads and allus wins. But some of these settlers know what spades are, I reckon." "And some'll certainly know what clubs are if they keep on with their nigger-stealing," spoke up Lem Stevens. To this the load-bearer paid no attention. His thoughts were on the signs of the times, and the man who was to lead in the great struggle. "There's a new dispensation a-comin'," he said with calm conviction. "But it warn't made plain what it be till I heard Abe Lincoln and Steve Douglas discussing some points of law for the first time. When I heard Lincoln were going to speak, I says, 'Now's your time. If you miss this chance, you won't maybe have another.' When I got there, I see Judge Douglas were appointed to open the meeting." "That'd give you a chance to see how the little giant would look alongside of the 6-footer," interrupted Socrates. "When I heard the judge, he give chapter and verse for every hole he bored in the Republican plank. But when Abe Lincoln rose up, he held some thunderin' big abolition nails to plug 'em with. Appeared like he as much says to Steve Douglas, "You just keep on borin', and I'll do the drivin'. It's a heap easier, for when you fellas get through borin', I'll have my plank nailed to the Constitution of this whole country." "I allow Steve Douglas had the law on his side," rejoined Elihu Guest. "But Lawyer Lincoln hadn't been speaking more than 10 minutes afore I see he were being called on, and appeared like I could hear the words, 'Judgment, judgment,' a-soundin' in the air. And if all the prairies of this here state had been sot on fire, I'd have sat there till he'd spoke the last word." "Shucks," exclaimed Socrates. "I don't reckon Steve Douglas cares, but I suspect he see it weren't no use sassin' back." Lem Stevens struck the log several hard, quick blows with his wooden leg. "But laws, what can words and book learning do agin the 10 Commandments?" ejaculated the load-bearer. "I reckon Judge Douglas were relying on soft sawder, but it won't hold the spout to the kettle if the fire's anyways overheated and the water's most boiled away," said Socrates. "As I were going to say," continued Elihu Guest, "it ain't words as counts as much as it are the feelings. A politician is about the same in this here as a preacher. He has to possess the spirit if he wants the power. According to my thinking, he has to throw it out till it covers the whole meeting." "I believe you're right," asserted Socrates nonchalantly. "I've heard the little giant more than once, and I allow he did look spry and plump and as boundin' as a rubber ball. But it ain't the horse that jumps the highest that can carry the furthest, and I reckon a man's got to be convicted hisself afore he convicts any other." "The spirit are more in the eye than it are in the tongue," said Elihu Guest, rising from his seat. "If Abe Lincoln looked at the worst slave driver long enough, Satan would give up every time." "'Pears like you're right," observed Socrates again. The load-bearer continued with increasing emphasis. "I see right away the difference atwixt Lincoln and Douglas warn't so much in Lincoln being a good ways over 6 foot, and Douglas a good ways under, as it were in their eyes. The judge looked like he was speaking agin time, but Abe Lincoln looked plumb through the meeting into the everlasting, the way Moses must have looked when he see Canaan ahead, and I can tell you I never did see a man look that way. The judge is some pumpkins for squeezing hisself in, but I reckon the 6-footer has got the rule in hand this time," remarked Socrates. "They're at the crossroads," ejaculated Lem Stevens. "But them there abolitionists are in a howling wilderness, and the parting of the ways don't lead nowhere. There ain't no signpost, not in this here case. I've been lost more than once by taking the wrong road, just when I felt dead certain I were on the right track. Gee whiz, I can take you to a place over near Edwardsville where nothing walking on 2 legs can tell the difference atwixt the points on a compass on a cloudy day. And even when the sun's a-shining, you got to smell the way, just like a hound, for seeing don't do no good. I'll tell you what it is in this here business where politics is right on the crossroads. They want something more than 2 eyes to see with. A man's got to know where he's a-going. I seen an Injun once. He put his ear to the ground to tell which road to take, and after a while he got up, give his breast a thump, and struck out as if he were a bloodhound after a nigger. And don't you go thinking he took the wrong road, neither. How do you allow they're going to free the niggers? They ain't got no weapons, and the slave owners are a sight cuter with shooting irons nor the abolitionists be. Ever since Daniel Boone settled the other side of the Ohio, the white folks of the South have been aiming at moving targets, all kinds of birds and varmints, flying and running, including niggers and Injuns. As for setting 'em free, said the load-bearer, I ain't allowing nothing but God Almighty's hand, and surely with that comet up yonder we are moving into conflicting times. If I had any doubts, my mind was set at rest when I heard Abe Lincoln speak. If he'd just risen up and looked at the folks, they would have felt his power just the same. I've seen him, said Zach Caverly, when he played mourning tunes on their heartstrings till they mourned with the mourners. Elihu Guest straightened himself up, and the tone of his voice changed. But somehow it appeared like Abe Lincoln would have such loads as no man ever carried since Christ walked in Israel. When I went over for to hear him, things looked mighty uncertain. Appeared like I had more than I could stand up under. But he hadn't spoke more than 10 minutes before I felt like I had never had no loads. I began to feel ashamed of being weary and complaining. When I went to hear him, I allowed the Lord might let me carry some loads away. But I soon see Abe Lincoln were equal to carrying his and mine too. And I set to wondering about the workings of Providence. But you were only a-listening to an abolitionist stumping this whole tarnation country, remarked Lem Stevens with all the bitterness he could put into the words. After all, I reckon religion and politics are about the same, broke in Socrates. Sin in politics, answered the load-bearer, are equal to sin in religion. They ain't no dividing line. The remark made Lem Stevens begin a loud and prolonged tattoo on the log with his wooden stump. Pete Cartwright has always been agin Abe Lincoln. How do you count for it? I allow Brother Cartwright has worked a heap of good as a preacher. But things ain't a-going to be changed by preaching alone. There'll be fire and brimstone for some, or that blazing star up yonder don't mean nothing, and there ain't no truth to the Scriptures. There were sounds as of something rushing through the underbrush, and the crackling of dry timber some distance away, and when I looked in that direction, I saw what seemed a flash of a lantern. One of the hounds under the cabin gave signs of uneasiness. Lowering his voice, the load-bearer continued, I feel like I did afore the war with Mexico, except we didn't see no comet then. They did make a confounded fuss over that war, observed Socrates, and I remember Clay and Calhoun having it hard over something or another. Both of 'em faced the music for a reelin' breakdown. Clay says to Calhoun, you've been expounding a point of law I ain't never discovered in the book of statutes. Your arguments are shaky, and your judgments are as splashy as the Mississippian flood time. The whole nation's caving in, and there ain't a man among you what knows enough to plug things up and stop the leaking. But Calhoun put the question as pert as a blue jay. What's a leaking, says he. It ain't the ship of state, it's the whiskey barrel. Just so, says Henry Clay, as sassy as a catbird in nesting time. You and your party have knocked the plug out, but me and my party are going to double damn that leaking. Old Hickory, I see, once did a Methodist meeting. Pete Cartwright were a-preaching when Old Hickory walked in. The presiding elder says to the preacher, that's Andrew Jackson. But Pete Cartwright didn't no ways care. Who is Andrew Jackson, he says. If he's a sinner, God'll damn him the same as he would a guinea nigger. And he went right on a-preaching. There's nothing I despise so much as an abolition Methodist, ejaculated Lem Stevens. Tar and feathers are a heap too good for some on 'em. This remark was evidently intended for the load-bearer, but he seemed not to hear. When you're corn husking, said Socrates, you put on gloves, but you take 'em off when you're groping around for sinners' souls. Some preachers and politicians take hold like they were the hounds and the people a passel of varmints. But a preacher that knows what he's about always takes the point of a meeting like he would the points of a horse. He has to spy out the kickers and the balky ones, and worst of all, them that's half Mustang and half mule, and act accordin'. I allow a man can do a sight with flowing words and soft soap, but as for the mules and crossbreeds, soft soap won't touch 'em. I agree with you there, Brother Cavalier, said the load-bearer. When the meeting's anyways conflictin', it are mighty hard to deal with the word. Some wants singin', some wants preachin', and some wants prayin'. I reckon it are as you say, replied Socrates. But you might as well send a retriever out of dead ducks with a tin kettle tied to his tail as to try to land some sinners with a long string of prayers. A man's got to roll up and wade in hisself if he wants to find them that's been winged. When folks sit and blink like brown owls, without flapping a wing or losing a feather, I want to know what a poor preacher can do. It ain't easy to tell who's been touched. There's a sided difference betwixt what a preacher has to do and what a politician has, answered Elihu Guest. A preacher has to wrestle with the sins of the world every time he stands afore the people. You see,
continued Zach Caverly, filling his pipe. "The responsibility ain't the same. In the meeting house, the man of God ain't got but one kind to wrestle with, and that are sinners. He's on a game what can't fly, seeing as how they ain't angels yet, and as they is occupying the floor, he's obliged to shoot low, allowing the crows a setting on the fence to set right where they be. But a politician is in a heap worse fix. He's obliged to deal with them what's on the fence, because he knows the crows are just waiting to see which side the fattest worms are coming up on. But them that's plumb full of religion ain't got no room for worms." Socrates lit his pipe, took a few puffs, and then went on. "I allow them lawyers and judges and stump speakers over to Springfield ain't fishing for snapping turtles with nothing but red feathers from a rooster's tail. A politician nowadays has got to be as cunning as a possum that's playing dead, and a heap cuter than a catamount a-laying around for the whole hog. For if he ain't, he'll be catched hisself. Think of the all-fired predicaments they find themselves in. Talk about wrestling with sin and Satan, Elihu. Why, there ain't a stump meeting but what a Republican has to spar the Democrats on a point of law and trip up the know-nothings on the questions of niggers. And while the Whigs are fanning him with brickbats, he's mighty lucky if he ain't expected to hold a candle to the devil while he's being robbed pretty nigh all his cucumbers and watermelons, and more'n half his whiskey and character." At this moment, the sudden arrival of 3 men on horseback interrupted the conversation. "Good evening, gentlemen," said the leader. "Have you heard of any runaways about here within the last day or two?" "I ain't heard of none. They don't never come this way," replied Socrates. "We're looking for 3 runaway slaves that are said to be somewhere in this vicinity." "About how long have they been out?" asked Lem Stevens. "We lost track of 'em 2 days ago. They are somewhere near this creek." "How many be they?" "2 women and a boy. There's a reward of $500. "Well, let me go with you," said Lem Stevens, hurriedly going towards his horse. "And if we don't see nothing of 'em tonight, I'll help you find 'em in the morning." After some futile words, the 3 men and Lem Stevens wished us good night and rode away. By a sudden turn in the chain of events, we had been brought to the verge that divides the high level of freedom from the abyss of bondage, and a feeling of distress seized hold of the company. The 2 men could find no words for speech, but out of the depths of the night, the voices of nature assailed them. From the woods behind us came the hooting and cries of owl and wildcat. From the prairie came tiny insects that floated past with buzzing whispers in the ears of conscience. Crickets sent a thrill of warning from under the logs. Tree toads whistled near the creek, and a whippoorwill soared and called over the cabin and the ghostly outlines of the woods. Everything was free except the fugitives, hovering somewhere near the cabin. Birds and animals could roam about at will. The comet had the universe for a circuit. Socrates, in his humble cabin, was a king in his easy independence. My father, with all his cares, could go and come as he pleased. Elihu Guest, in spite of his loads, enjoyed the freedom of the earth as far as his eyes could see, or his horses carry him. And now, perhaps within a few hundred yards of us, 3 human beings were still panting in the throes of bondage. But the time had come to speak, and as my father and the drover joined us, the load-bearer said, "It are the mother and her boy and gal. I allow they ain't going to be separated in this world." "Well, you talk as if you knowed all about it," remarked Socrates. "But they'll be ketched afore tomorrow noon if they're anywheres around here." "I'm only telling you my idea, and I reckon you'll find I'm right." The load-bearer walked to the other side of the cabin, and stood for some moments without speaking. "Just you keep still and sit right where you be till I come back," he said, returning towards us. He walked along the road where it bordered the woods. The 3 mounted men had come down this road. We all wondered what impulse could have induced him to take that direction. The load-bearer had not been gone more than 2 or 3 minutes before Zach Caverly's favorite hound set up a plaintive whining under the cabin. "Spy, keep still there," said his master. "You see, that old dog's got wind of something queer. I've learned 'em all to keep as still as mice when me and other folks are about, but there's something unusual a getting ready. A spy wouldn't as much as sneeze. He beats all the dogs I ever had. That hound can smell, and as for hearing, I believe he can hear what's a-going on most anywheres. But you wouldn't think he could tell shucks from hoe cakes, his looks are so innocent and pleadin'. He used to be the best fighter among 'em, but now he knows it tain't wisdom to be brash. It took me nigh on 3 year to learn him the difference atwixt wolf and bear, or skunk and wildcat, and all the other varmints, and that ain't saying nothing about 2-legged creatures. You see, it were this-a-way. I were obleeged to point to the head of any varmint that had been shot or trapped, using only one word, and that word meaning the varmint. And by calling the names over and over again, he got to know what I meant when I asked, "Air it wolf? Air it bear?" and so on, plumb down to "Air it nigger?" Socrates now called on the hound to come out. Spy came to his master, and looking into his face, seemed to expect some command. Socrates began, "Air it wolf?" The dog gave no sign. "Air it bear?" Still no response. "Air it nigger?" The old dog gave unmistakable signs of assent. "Them runaways ain't far off. But I ain't a-going to let Spy go after 'em. He might scare 'em away from Elihu, and he'll bring 'em in if they're alive and kickin'. If there's anyone in this whole country as knows more than that old hound, it'er Elihu Guest. He's after loads day and night, and he ain't happy unless he's getting hisself into a bushel of trouble. Old Spy and him were close friends from the word go, and I reckon Elihu has rescued more runaways than any other abolitionist in this here district. But they ain't never catched him at it. They might as well look for a sow's ear in a bear's den." I thought I could hear the sound of voices in the direction the load-bearer had gone, but I soon began to think I must have been mistaken, for not till nearly half an hour later did we hear him coming towards the cabin. He was walking as fast as he could, with a boy in one arm and a woman leaning on the other. "Great Jehoshaphat!" exclaimed Socrates. "If Elihu ain't got more'n enough for a load, but he's mistaken about there being 3 on 'em. I allow 2's enough, such as they be." Elihu Guest came full into view. Even with his firm support, the woman hanging on his arm was hardly able to walk. But scarcely had he put down the boy when another figure was seen approaching. It was the woman's daughter, a handsome octoroon of about 17, hobbling along with the aid of a crutch made from a dry branch. "I'll be darned if he weren't right after all," observed Socrates, hurrying into the cabin to make a fire. "We got plenty time. Them that's scouting around these diggings won't be back again tonight." The fugitives were placed on the ground, with the logs behind them as props, and the load-bearer asked, "About how long air it since you had any victuals?" I couldn't hear the answer, but Elihu Guest exclaimed, 3 days without victuals, and all in 'em most dead." Elihu made haste with the coffee, while Socrates was hurrying with the supper. Once in a while a groan came from the group of figures. The sound mingled with the mysteries of the surrounding darkness. It put fresh courage into the heart of the load-bearer, and strengthened him to assume still greater burdens. Socrates worked in silence, and during this time we were all wondering what ought to be done with the fugitives. To let them be caught was out of the question, but what to do with them after they had partaken of supper was a point that puzzled everyone. My father thought it dangerous to leave them so near the cabin. To the great relief of all, the driver mounted his horse and rode away, perhaps not wishing to become involved in any responsibility and to steer clear of a situation which might compromise him in the eyes of the law. "Looky here," remarked Zach Caverly to the load-bearer. "You don't reckon he's going over Lem Stevens' way, do you?" "I don't reckon he are," replied the load-bearer. "'Pears like he allus turns off there by Ebenezer Hicks's cornfield." The coffee was ready, and the load-bearer and Socrates were serving it out in the big blue china cups which we had used at our supper. The bacon and hoe cakes would soon follow. Every moment now seemed like an hour. My father, Elihu, and Socrates went into the cabin to talk over the affair and decide on what to do. They were coming out of the cabin when the drover returned, bringing the news that the slave-catchers had decided to pay Socrates another visit that night. It did not take long for the load-bearer to come to a decision. He called for aid, and one by one the 3 runaways were lifted into his wagon. "Where be you going, Elihu?" asked Socrates. "They've seen you here, and you'll be called on, for sure and certain." "I don't know more than you. replied the load-bearer, "but I ain't a-going to stop till God Almighty tells me." He drove off into the night, taking the road to the east. We followed on the same road shortly after, but met no one on the way home. When we arrived at the log house, we found that it, too, had been visited by the slave hunters. Part 5. My Visit to the Load-Bearer's Home. My mother was busy getting ready for another baking. She had baked the day before, and I could not help wondering what all the extra bread was for. I had not long to wait for an answer to my thoughts. She stopped in the middle of her work, cleaned the rolling pin of dough, and went to the pantry where she stood and looked for some moments at the things inside. "Oh dear," she said, with one of her gentle sighs, which I always understood so well. "There's not much, but what there is must go today, and in a day or two I shall send some more." Out came all the bread and the meat and a pound of coffee with sugar. These were stored away in the saddlebags, for she said it was too far to walk, and I would have to saddle my pony. "But where to?" I asked with surprise. "To Mrs. Guest's. These things are for her." "The load-bearer married?" "Why, of course he's married, like all good Christians. And you'll be married too some day, when the proper time comes." I had pictured him as kind of a hermit, living somewhere all alone, perhaps being fed by ravens, like Elijah the prophet, and even now I could hardly believe that he had a regular fixed abode. I was to tell Mrs. Guest she could count on my mother's aid when she had visitors from the south, which meant fugitive slaves trying to reach Canada. The affair at the Cabin of Socrates had been discussed between my parents, and this was the result. No member of the family had ever been to the home of Elihu Guest. We knew he lived near a large creek, some 4 or 5 miles southwest of the meeting house, so off I went in the full belief that I would find the place by asking here and there on the way. The country beyond the meeting house was like another world to me. The prairie, the dim outline of the woods beyond, the atmosphere all combined to produce a sense of freshness and novelty. And the effect on my mind could not have been greater had I gone 100 miles from home. After riding what seemed to me a long distance, a man in a wagon directed me to a road bordering a strip of wood which led into a region of trees and underbrush, with patches of prairie here and there, and vistas of the creek and the undulating ground beyond. The land had a gentle slope towards the water. The beech trees rose to a great height, and now and then, through an opening in the woods, I could see a distance of 2 miles, but in most places the world all around was hidden by rocky knobs, thick underbrush, and immense trees. What a place to hide in, I thought, and I was beginning to fear my search for the house would not end in success when I heard the barking of a dog some considerable distance to the left. Stopping to consider what to do, I detected faint tracks of wagon wheels leading in that direction. I followed as best I could over a parterre of leaves and moss, and the debris of decayed timber. Penetrating still further, I came upon a clearing, and then I caught a glimpse of a small frame house, almost hidden by trees and shrubs. As I approached, 3 savage dogs, which I at first took to be wolves chained up, began a fierce barking and howling. As I was about to get off my pony and ask if Elihu Guest lived here, a thin, pale-faced woman, her hair streaked with gray, opened the door. Then, wiping her mouth with her apron, she exclaimed, "Bless you, sonny. You ain't come with bad news, have you? My old man's been gone 2 full days and nights." It was Cornelia Guest, the load-bearer's wife. I told her who had sent me and what I had brought, but it did not allay her anxiety when I recounted the incidents at the Cabin of Socrates. "Get right down and come in and tell me all about it. I suspect you need a rest. It always makes my head ache riding over the prairie in the hot sun." I got off the pony, and after tying up, took the things into the kitchen. "Land, how good your ma is, sending me all these things in case of necessity. Elihu told me about her. Some folks don't need to have wings to be angels. How did your ma know I hadn't but 1 loaf of bread left? It do beat all how things work out. I allowed to do some baking, but somehow I couldn't get to work. 'Pears like when Elihu's away and I don't know his whereabouts, I can't get nothing done. Law me, if here ain't coffee. Elihu ain't never ceased talking about your ma's coffee. All this time I was wondering what she would do if her husband should fail to return before evening. I'm right glad you've come to cheer a body. The hours are longer when you're most dead worrying. When he stayed away afore, he allowed he wouldn't have time to get back, and I warn't no ways afeard he'd got hisself into trouble. There was something in her voice and look that aroused my sympathy. I set up all last night praying and reading in the good book. It weren't in mortal nature to sleep. She seemed far away in thought. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, and I began to ask myself why everyone had so much trouble. As I only sat and listened, she had become unconscious of my presence in the house. But after a while she straightened up and resumed. I reckon he took the runaways over to Uriah Busby's, and from there he'll take 'em on to the next station. She mused for a time again, and then continued. But it ain't easy. The risks are terrible. But then, as Elihu says, when the Lord and his hosts are with you, there ain't no call to feel scared. Elihu and Ike Snedeker and Ebenezer Carter and Tom Mellandy, they don't none of 'em know what it are to fail. After sitting for some time without speaking, all of a sudden she clasped her hands and rose from her seat, and stretching out her thin, bare arms, with trembling body and quivering lips, her voice went up in a loud, long wail. Lord, help a poor forsaken woman. Help me this day, for my troubles are more than I can bear without you. Make it so I can sit here alone without repining. Send Elihu home, O my Lord and my God, for I can't live without him. Her look appalled me. I saw grief manifest in words and gesture. I pictured to myself my mother, pleading with the Eternal. I imagined what the log house would be with my father absent, and his whereabouts unknown. How I wished to say something comforting to the lonely woman standing there. But I, who could never express to my mother what I thought and felt when she was in trouble, could not find words to comfort a stranger. I was overcome with a pity and sympathy which I was powerless to express in words. And I wondered what would become of the little home in the woods if the load-bearer never returned. It seemed as if I had known this house and its occupants all my life, that we were in some way closely related. I proposed to ride over to the Busbys for any news I could gather there. It would take about an hour and a half, but we could arrive at no decision, and I was thinking of returning when we saw Elihu Guest slowly wending his way home through the most unfrequented part of the woods. He had followed the creek a good part of the way, and his wagon seemed full of farming implements and sacks of grain. Cornelia Guest stood at the door awaiting his arrival. "For the land's sake," she ejaculated when he got within talking distance, "where have you been? I don't know whether I'm a-looking right at you, or whether it's your ghost a-driving them horses. How do you 'low I been sitting here 2 enduring nights through without you? Now, Cornelia, don't you take on so. When I tell you all about it, you'll be surprised and mighty glad I didn't come right home from the post office. But I want you to help me unload right here, for it don't matter where we set these things." We all went to work. The implements, or what I took to be such, were soon placed on the ground. But the sacks, instead of containing grain or potatoes, were filled with straw. We lifted off those nearest the dashboard. The load-bearer flung back a horse blanket, and 3 faces, frightened, haggard, and woe-begone, looked out from the hay underneath. It was the quadroon mother and her 2 octoroon children. "White folks!" gasped Cornelia, stunned by the unexpected. "I allow the 2 are white enough. More's the pity." "Goodness me, Elihu Guest," protested Cornelia when the 2 stepped into the kitchen. "We ain't got no place for white folks. There's plenty of victuals, but we ain't got no room. You know we ain't. And 2 on 'em looked like they hadn't but one more breath to let out, and they were holding on to it till they got here." "Well, now, just give me a little time to let out my breath for me, too. I've been holding it in ever since the night before last. Where on the face of this earth have you fished out such a load? You ain't never carried home nothing to equal it. Where have you been? Do tell." "Why, ain't Bub here told you?" He told me about 3 runaways you found over at Zach Cavalry's, 2 on 'em most dead. Well, just so. And I drove 'em to Brother Busby's, where I were obliged to wait for a good chance to get away. And now they're in the wagon there. Cornelia sank into a seat. Amazement and indignation were depicted on every feature. Her jaws were firmly set, and I could hear her teeth grate. White slaves! I know you ain't given to jokes, Elihu, but I can't get it into my head how there can be slaves that are as white as we be. Somehow I couldn't ever believe it, but according to your telling, I got to believe it. And now I've seen it with my own eyes. She did not seem like the woman who, a short time before, was complaining of her sorrows and tribulations. Indignation had given way to a desire to act, to help, to save the lives of the fugitives, and send them on their way towards Canada. I were calculating to bring 'em in the house, remarked the load-bearer as the 2 left the kitchen and walked over to the wagon. But I reckon it are safer to take 'em to the barn. There'll be a mite of a chance that if anyone comes after 'em, they won't go to the barn to look. Well, there ain't no objections to clean new hay for beds, and we can take some things over from the house. Tomorrow I'll have a step about and find a new hiding place, for I heard another band of runaways are somewhere south of here, and they may be along afore we know it. Well, don't you go to doing too much all to once, or you'll be ailing and things'll be a sight worse. Tomorrow I'll take 'em to the cave by the creek. I allowed to have it all fixed afore now, but things have come about mighty sudden. That cave needs a heap of fixin'. I ain't had no sleep for 2 nights, and I scarcely know what I'm a-doin'. For the first time I took notice of the load-bearer's tired face. His eyes expressed the hope and faith which inspired him, but a great weariness made his walk heavy and his movements slow. It was all Elihu and Cornelia Guest could do to get the eldest of the 2 women out of the wagon into the barn. There was enough to keep all hands busy. I ran to and fro with blankets and pillows, while Mrs. Guest attended to the immediate wants of the fugitives. When I had done all I could at the barn and returned to the house, I found Socrates standing close to the dogs. He was evidently in one of his keenest talking moods. "You can count on what I'm telling you," he was saying. "I have fought varmints my whole life, and I've teached dogs, and I've fed 'em so as to make 'em win. Maybe you'll be in for a fight afore long, and you can't keep 'em chained without having 'em fall off some and get sort of limp in the forelegs. I recollect a dog fights as much with his legs as he does with his teeth. If Lem Stevens's bloodhounds come nosing up this way, you'll be in for a lively kick-up." "I've been wondering how you keep your dogs so sleek and spry," remarked the load-bearer. "What do you feed 'em on? Any particular kind of meat?" "Yeah, give 'em most anything but liver, and let 'em run around considerable," replied Socrates. "But tie 'em up and starve 'em for a day or so afore you calculate to use 'em for any fighting." Zach Cavalry was eyeing with extraordinary interest the 3 huge wolfhounds, whose cold agate eyes conjured up in my imagination images of the haunts of wolf and bear, and the cruel romance of wild and wilderness. Compared with the load-bearer's dogs, the hounds at the Cabin of Socrates were the incarnation of docility and affection. The wolfhounds gave us a look now and then of glacial indifference. There was no caressing to be indulged in here, no patting on the back, no words of encouragement expected or needed. I could not distinguish any difference between them. They all looked the same height, color, and size, but the load-bearer knew the characteristics of each. As I looked at the wolfhounds and then at the meek, compassionate face of Elihu Guest, I was struck with the incongruity of the scene. The dogs all ferocity, the man all meekness. But from that moment I saw the load-bearer in a new light. Under the humane countenance there dwelt the inflexible will, the inexorable determination to dare and to do. How different he was now, standing beside his wolfhounds, from what he looked on his first visit to the log house. The benevolent look was still there, but the vague, dreamy expression was gone, and in its place appeared a realization of present responsibilities. Plotting and planning had taken the place of dreams. "They don't need no coddling," observed Socrates as he eyed them one after the other, slowly and critically. "I ain't seen no dog flesh equal to 'em since I was down in Tennessee. And if you treat 'em as I say, you'll have good reason to be thankful, Elihu. For the Lord made 'em, Brother Cavally, and they are here according to His will. And I'm right glad you see their points are points to reckon on. I ain't see their equal, declared Socrates, giving the load-bearer a knowing look. They're as full of points as a porcupine or a quills, and I reckon it ain't no ways discommodin' for a man in your circumstances to have such pets layin' around just pining away 'cause there ain't no live meat for to clean their teeth on. Appears like they ain't got no feelin's except for huntin' and fightin', remarked Elihu Guest, contemplating the animals much as he would so many savage Indians. They don't show no particular likin' for anybody, returned Socrates. But you'll allow a good wagger makes a poor watcher, and some on 'em gets more'n enough to eat by not knowing they have tails. Why, if there ain't Sister Busby, exclaimed the load-bearer, as Serena emerged from the woods on a big, slow, floundering sorrel. Elihu Guest seemed ill at ease when he saw her coming. She came like a rain cloud, and her presence threw a cold douche over all. Serena Busby's tongue was all the more dangerous because her intentions were good, and everybody liked her. But she was apt to tell the gravest secrets without being conscious of what she was saying. "Where's Cornelie?" she shouted, before the sorrel came to a stop at the kitchen door. "I brought you over some bear's grease and camphor," she went on, as she caught sight of Mrs. Guest coming from the barn. "I forgot all about it this morning when Elihu left, everyone being so flustered." "How good you be," said Cornelia. "I was just saying to Elihu just now that we hadn't nothing in the house to rub with, and the gal's ankle do need tending to. As for getting a doctor, it ain't no use thinking of such a thing. There ain't no one except Doc Reed in Jacksonville we could trust to keep the secret, and he's too far away. This is what we all use for sprains and bruises. You know she ain't had no bones broke. It all come about by having to jump over logs like rabbits with hounds after 'em that night when the slave hunters were on their tracks. It's horrible to see the poor thing suffer so, but her mother is plumb used up. She wouldn't taste a mite of victuals over to my house, and I tried her with everything." "Sakes alive!" exclaimed Serena, putting her hand into a deep pocket and taking out a small parcel. "I almost forgot about the tea. It's green tea, Cornelie, some that Uriah got the last time he was down to Alton, and if that don't make her set up, nothing will. It'll give her backbone. But law, ain't the children white? It was the boys' curly hair made me think of runaways, but I declare I'd take 'em for white folks if they was dressed up real nice." "I didn't take no particular notice the night Elihu discovered 'em," observed Socrates, "and I ain't seen 'em since, not to look square at 'em." Cornelia Guest had no more to say. She pretended a deep interest in the things Mrs. Busby had brought, but her mind was elsewhere. Her face looked what she felt. "Ain't you going to get off and stop a spell, Sister Busby?" inquired the load-bearer with bland apathy. "Yes, do," said his wife. "Surely you ain't going back without seeing where we put 'em. We done the best we could. It's a sight cleaner than some beds I've had afore now. Well, I promised Uriah I'd be right back without tying up, but I'll get off and make 'em a real nice cup of this here tea, and we'll take it over to 'em." "Well, they've had coffee," observed Cornelia, with an effort to be polite, and as a mild protest against green tea. The two women went into the kitchen, and I heard the load-bearer remark, "Sister Busby's got a sight of horse sense, but she do need the bridle now and again." "Sereny's just like a skittish yearling," commented Socrates. "But don't you go to bridling her tongue, or she'll take the bit betwixt her teeth, and a prairie fire won't head her off. Give her plenty tethering ground and plenty facts to nibble on, but don't let her chaw too close to the stumps." "You can lead a filly to the trough, Brother Cavally," replied the load-bearer, "but you can't make her drink more than just so much. Some folks are always thirsting for water from other folks' wells, but nothing but a running stream of gossip will slake Sister Busby's thirst for more knowledge." "That's a fact, said Socrates. "But the worst is the stream runs square through your diggins." "As things are going now, Sereny knows enough to want to know a heap more," observed the load-bearer. "I'm plumb with you when you tell me not to let her nibble till she comes to the cobblestones." The tea was soon made, for Mrs. Guest kept the fire going and the water hot. No sooner had she and Mrs. Busby disappeared into the barn than Alec Jordan came galloping up by the shortest cut from the main road. "Mom told me to give you this," he said to the load-bearer, handing him a letter. "It's from Isaac Snedeker. He give it to Mom to send." Elihu opened and read, while Zach Caverly stood and waited for the news. The load-bearer heaved a sigh. "Brother Snedeker says he's a-comin' here tomorrow night with 8 runaways." "Whoopee!" exclaimed Socrates. Then a thought struck him. "Looky here, Alec," he said. "You just light out as quick as ever you can. There's someone at the barn that mustn't know you've been here. Don't you wait a minute. Take the trail through the woods by the creek as far as you can, or maybe the runaways will get catched." The load-bearer had his eyes fixed on the barn, expecting every moment to see Mrs. Busby emerge and then ride part of the way home with Alec Jordan, when more than one secret would be revealed concerning the intentions of Isaac Snedeker. Alec, whose horse was young and in fine condition, was off at a bound, the animal clearing like a buck every obstacle in his path. Hardly had he got out of sight when Serena Busby made her appearance, followed by Cornelia Guest, who, weary and distracted, let the visitor do all the talking.
Part 6. At the Post Office. One morning I went with my father to the post office, which was in a small store by the railway station about 6 miles distant. How bleak and forsaken it was! The place consisted of 2 houses and some freight cars shunted off the main line. The prairie here had a desolate look, but to the north lay a wooded district, and here my father brought me to stand on a small embankment, to watch the train coming up around the curve out of the woods. The sight made an impression that was lasting, for at this moment it is just as vivid as it was then. It made my nerves tingle and opened the door to a new world of wonders. The train itself, filled with passengers, did not interest me. It was the engine, with its puffing steam, its cowcatcher, and its imposing smokestack that possessed the attraction. The day soon came, however, when the locomotive took second place in my imagination, and the passengers the first. What, after all, was the steam engine compared with human beings, animals, and birds? What was its smoke and movement compared with pictures of earth, sky, and water? At rest, the locomotive ceased to interest, but the aspect of the world was always changing. A landscape had its 4 seasons. Every manifestation of nature harmonized with some mood or condition of the mind, and I watched the buzzards and bluebirds, the cranes and chickadees, the rabbits and squirrels with renewed and ever-increasing interest. Nature changed but never grew stale. The air was full of song and color, the earth full of forms and movement, and the rapid motion of a garter snake was, after all, more fascinating than the movement of an engine with its train of cars. And how could the noise of the puffing compare with the chorus of red-winged blackbirds? Nature is the one perennial charm. But this was not the opinion of poor Monsieur Duval, one of the unfortunate settlers who had mistaken the wilderness for a ready-made paradise. All the loungers at the post office looked like members of the same family, except this Frenchman and a German settler whom they called Dutchy. Duval resembled a shipwrecked mariner among the inhabitants of some remote island, the secret of whose language and customs he could not fathom. But he and the German were full of life, while the others seemed too listless and lazy to do more than whittle sticks, and once in a while hit a certain spot by an expectoration of tobacco juice. The scene was set off by rows of tea canisters, coffee sacks, bolts of calico, sugar barrels, bacon, rice, and plug tobacco, with sundry farming implements stored at the back, and a few pigeonholes for letters. The shuffling figure of the goateed proprietor stood in the midst of all, a little taller and perhaps a little more languid than any of the others, too indifferent to talk, yet putting in a word now and again mechanically, without stopping to calculate the effect of what he said, and without being interested in any person or thing. He aroused my interest as soon as he said to my father, "Well, I'm going to wind her up. Going to Vamoose." "You're going to leave us?" inquired my father. "Yes," he drawled. "Going to wind up and move on." A man sitting on the edge of a large box half filled with empty sacks called out, "Which away?" "Over to Pike County," was the answer. The Frenchman, who was standing against the counter, straightened up. "Me too," he exclaimed, tapping his bosom once for each word. "Me too. I wind her up. I go Vamoose."
Going to sell out? Asked my father. If I no sell him, I give him away, he answered with a gesture of supreme disgust. How long have you been here? Asked the storekeeper. 2, 3 year. Well, hardly long enough to give the country a fair trial, said my father. Try him? I give him plenty time. The farm? He try me like Job was try, with his sheep and his camel. Have you had much illness? Do I look sick? My wife, my son, myself, we work like nigger. We have no time for eat, no time for sleep, no time for wash ourselves. Well, you must have taken up too much land. Most of the trouble comes from that. No, monsieur, we no have too much, but we been too much for the land. I suppose you're from some part of the South. Me? I come from New Orleans. I have one big family. I lose him with the yellow fever. My friends say, you go up the Mississippi, you escape the fever. I take my wife and son to St. Louis. Someone say, you take one farm in Illinois, the soil she been so rich, you scratch him 2, 3 times with the hoe. Everything come up while you look. When I come on the farm, the soil she been too hard for scratch. I get one plow so long for cut the big root, and 4 pair ox for pull her. But the wildcat come in the night. She climb up the tree and take the turkey. The fox break in the hen house and take the chicken. In the morning I find the head and some feather. He stopped to consider a moment, then continued. I keep some beef or make beeswax. I go look. I find the hive sprawl on the ground. They have left me nothing. What animal do you suppose it was? I asked. Tell me, monsieur, does the fox like for eat the bee? Does the wildcat like for chew the beeswax? Does the mink like for have her nose sting? Ah, monsieur, I likes for someone tell me that. Duval gave a fierce look at the man sitting on the box, for he had just fallen over on the sacks in a spasm of laughter, his feet in the air, and we concluded he could tell what had become of the Frenchman's bees if he chose. But that is not the worst. One time I have a very good crop. The corn, the legumes, the pumpkin, she all been planted and come up. But the army worm, she come. Next day I go look, she leave me nothing but the cobblestone. Then, as if he had forgotten something, he added, the cow come home and I go for milk her. She been dry like my old boot. The worm have eat her fodder. He let his arms fall in a limp gesture of resignation, and taking from his pocket a cheap cigar, and leaning with one arm on the counter, he began smoking, letting out great puffs through his nose, as if in this way he were getting rid of all the evil things connected with pioneer life. The hangdog faces of the men sitting and lolling about were enlivened by grins, and ironical marks were freely indulged in. Say, Frenchie, said the man sitting on the box, what'll you take to hire out just to keep away bears and skunks? Duval gave the man one contemptuous look. Evidently he was not going to answer. He smoked while he walked carelessly towards the box, and when within a few feet of it, made a sudden, cat-like bound at the man, clutching his throat with the grip of a frenzied gorilla, while he forced him down into the box head foremost. The onlookers, stunned by the suddenness of the attack, seemed dazed and helpless, staring at the scene as if held by some horrible fascination. Then a gurgling sound came from the victim, causing someone to cry out, I'll be hanged if he ain't choking him to death. I'm derned if he ain't, exclaimed someone else. Haul him off, shouted the storekeeper, aroused out of his lethargy. We don't want no dead man around here. The storekeeper, assisted by one of the men's friends, began to tug at the Frenchman. Hardly had they done so when a man with a knife made a rush for Duval. But the Dutchman was waiting his chance. He felled him to the floor by one quick blow from his great open hand, the hard, thick palm and huge long fingers making a splitting noise like a blade of steel on a sheet of ice. No, by shemini, he growled as he picked up the knife and shook it in their faces. You don't come them games here. When you give me that chiffry, I have some buckshot ready, but mine wife don't let me shoot nothing. Now I give you something mit interest. And with that, he brought the same open hand down on the man who had helped to pull Duval off his victim, He fell to the floor as if struck with a mallet, and I shuddered, for he seemed to be stone dead. This was the third surprise within a few seconds. The man in the box was not yet able to rise to his feet, but Duval was looking about him, ready for more work, and well inclined to keep it going. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was all afire. He stood like some ferocious animal in the arena, ready for any opponent, with a firm faith in his 2 hands, his 2 legs, his nimble body, and his quick wit, while the Dutchman had good reason to pin his faith to a pair of broad palms, which resembled the paws of a bear in thickness, and a body unimpaired by fiery whiskey and malarial fever. 2 of the gang were now placed hors de combat, and this without the use of knives or firearms. It was now 4 against 2, and the Frenchman had evidently summed up the situation at a glance. With a quick twisting movement, he turned his body like a practiced wrestler, and the man standing beside him found himself sprawling on the floor, his feet knocked from under him by the deft maneuvers of Duval's foot. All was now over. After this, the gang resembled nothing so much as a pack of whipped dogs, and the stillness that reigned in the store had something of the stillness of the battlefield after the fury of the battle. Duval and the Dutchman left the store together and became close friends from that day. Part 7. A Night of Mystery. On certain evenings, my father would sit before the big open fireplace and watch the burning logs with unalloyed satisfaction. He would see pictures in the blazing wood, and he had a science of his own in the mingling of different logs. "How well that dried hickory burns with the damp walnut," he would say, taking the tongs and shifting the pieces now a little more to the front, now a little further back. He taught me to see castles, people, and faces in the flames and embers, and I knew what colors to expect from the different woods. He kept some that were full of sap that would burn slowly, others were split up to dry. While sitting before the fire on a clear bracing night, my father was wont to forget every care and abandon himself to the pure pleasures of the hearth. He would dream of the past, of friends in the old country, and more than once he would remark to me, taking the tongs and pointing, "There's a face that reminds me of poor so-and-so." He loved to revisit the old familiar scenes while the fire gave them momentary life and set them before him in frames of gold and flaming opal. Then he would tell me stories of the wild animals of the old homestead, of the tracks of the marten in the snow, and how he discovered its hiding place, of a memorable fox hunt when one of his friends held the fox up by the tail, and another friend cried out from a distance, "Don't hurt the fox! Don't hurt the fox!" and of his sojourn in Paris during the reign of Louis Philippe. At such times my mother added a spirit of cheerfulness by some joyful exclamation such as, "There's a letter in the candle," as if the simple expression in itself would assist the arrival of good news from afar, and when I looked I saw a large flaming blob on the side of the wick pointing towards us. I cannot remember whether the letters arrived as the candle so often announced, but how vividly I recollect the nights when I lay awake in the next room and heard my parents discuss the uncertainty of the future, the imminent need of funds to carry on the work of the farm, and the possibility of failure and ruin. Such conversations occurred after the other members of the family had gone to bed, but I heard everything, and night after night I listened to these talks and racked my brain, wondering how it would all end. My distress was even greater than that of my mother, for she knew what I did not, and she could still hope. After such talks, the quivering song of the cricket dotted the stillness with an accent of deeper melancholy, while the heavy pendulum slowly measured out the minutes between midnight and the dismal twilight of dawn. We were all sitting quietly together the evening after my visit to the load-bearers' home, my mother with a Bible in her lap, the only book she ever read while in the log house, my father reading a newspaper containing an account of a recent speech by Abraham Lincoln. My mother's face looked paler and more pensive than usual. For some days previous to this, my father had had a misunderstanding with one of the settlers. The only weapon in the house was a double-barreled gun, and even this stood unloaded against the wall in a corner of the sitting room. No dog was kept on the place for the reason that a dog was regarded as one of the things most likely to cause trouble with the neighbors. The wind was blowing across the prairie from the east. My mother seemed apprehensive, and I must have caught some of the thoughts which filled her mind with gloomy presentiments.
During a lull of the wind, a sound reached us from the prairie. It might have been a shout or a call. How vividly it all comes before me now. She looked inquiringly at my father, who was absorbed in his newspaper and heard nothing. I needed no words to tell me what she was thinking. Her face assumed a grave and anxious look. I was hoping the sound might be nothing more than the noise of belated travelers passing on horseback when we heard it again, like a confused mumbling menace, this time a little nearer, still disguised in the muffled wind. She walked into the next room greatly agitated, but instantly returned and began to read in the prayer book. My father had just put aside his newspaper when a low, hollow murmur came from the prairie. "What can it be?" asked my mother in a voice scarcely audible. Without answering, he went into the next room for the ammunition, took the gun from the corner, and began to load it with buckshot. It seemed to me he had never looked so tall, so grim, so determined as when he rammed the wadding down with the ramrod. Then he went to the front door and listened. My mother sat with closed eyes like one in a trance, until it seemed to me as if by some unaccountable hocus-pocus we had been thrust into a world where pantomime and mystery had taken the place of speech, and we were waiting for some sudden and terrible stroke of destiny. What was going to happen? Was it the end of all things at the log house? My father decided not to go out by the front way, and after the light was removed, he opened the kitchen door and stood outside in the dark. "The moon is just rising," said my mother in a half-whisper, looking through the window of the front room. Then I looked, and as the clouds drifted by, I saw the moon in the shape of a gleaming scythe. A sudden chill of autumn had come to the house. She hurried out to beg my father to come in, but he was creeping from corner to corner and from tree to tree, with the gun held before him, cocked and ready for that deadly aim for which he was so well known. After going as far as the smokehouse and waiting there some time, he returned. He thought the sounds must have been due to some prowling animal. He was about to give up further search when the moaning was heard again, out a little beyond the trees. And then, as my mother stood trembling at the door, a voice shouted, "Don't shoot, massa! Don't shoot! For the Lord's sake, don't you shoot!" My father went straight towards the voice. "We done lost, massa," someone shouted as soon as he reached the open. "We is looking for Massa Guest's place." "Come in, come in." My father came back into the kitchen with 2 Negro fugitives. "Where have you been?" "Mass Snedeker done drop us over there," said one of the Negroes, pointing west. "He was running you off?" "Yes, massa. And finding he was chased, let you down, and so you got lost." "Yes, massa." Just then, with terrible suddenness, came a loud knocking at the front door, for during the talk and confusion, no one had heard any noise in the road. My father took his gun, and standing at one side of the door, asked who was there. "Isaac Snedeker," answered a familiar voice. Open went the door, and in rushed Ike Snedeker, one of the most intrepid souls that ever risked death for the sake of conscience. A man stood before us who had never known fear. One glance at his face would be enough to make an enemy stop and think twice before coming to close quarters with such a being. He was courage incarnate, with the shaggy head of a lion, the sharp, invincible eye of an eagle, the frame of an athlete, and the earnestness of a convinced reformer. His hair stood out, thick and bushy, and his bearded face, with the upper lip clean shaven, gave to the whole countenance a massive, formidable look that inspired every fugitive with confidence and struck fear into the hearts of his secret foes. "I've lost 2 runaways," he said as he walked through to the kitchen. "I had to let them out of the wagon over there, near the maple grove. We were followed." "I think they are here, and I came near to shooting one of them by mistake," said my father. "I directed them to come this way as near I could, hoping they would strike through the prairie at this place." My mother was now bringing the fugitives something to eat, when Isaac Snedeker said peremptorily, "Come along, it's now or never. We've got to get to Brother Guest's with that load before midnight. You see, I've had to gather 'em up here and there in different places, and I have in the wagon out there 2 lots, one sent over by Ebenezer Carter and the other by Brother Wolcott. If we get caught, it'll be the first time, but they'd get a haul that would amount to something. I've got 14 altogether." The 2 fugitives left without having time to drink a cup of coffee, and we all went to the road to see them off.
The wagon was full of frightened, trembling runaways, Negroes, mulattoes, and octoroons. Not a moment was lost. Isaac Snedeker had only to speak to his horses, a fine, powerful team, to send them going at great speed down the road towards the appointed meeting place at Elihu Guest's. We went back into the house, where my mother sank exhausted into a rocking chair, but she still had another ordeal to go through. Prayers had been said, and we were all about to retire for the night, when the noise of galloping horses and men talking could be heard on the road. One moment of suspense followed another. Footsteps were heard near the kitchen door. Then there came a light and somewhat timid rapping, as if the persons outside were not certain about that being the right place. My father opened the door, this time without asking who was there. 2 disreputable-looking men stood before him, one of them scowling at us through the door like some ferocious animal. They carried pistols and dirks. Their eyes were shaded by slouched hats that partly concealed the upper part of their faces, so that for all we knew, they might have been neighbors living at no great distance from the log house. "Have you seen any runaways hanging around here?" asked the elder man, looking up from under his hat, and with an expression that told of a fearful admixture of malicious cunning and moral cowardice. "I have," answered my father. "Who delegated you to look for them?" The fellow hesitated, then he stammered. "Be you a fire-eating abolitionist?" "I have voted for Abraham Lincoln once, if that is what you mean by being an abolitionist." "You ain't been long in this country," observed the younger man. "Long enough to become an American citizen and vote," replied my father. This surprised them. They looked confused, but they braced themselves for a final effort. "We're after them runaways, and we don't calculate to leave here without taking 'em along." "They went from here some time ago, so you'll have to look elsewhere if you want to find them." "Let's go over to the barn," said the elder of the 2. They started for the barn, but stopped just beyond the big locust tree, and I heard the words, "Say, Jake, I don't like the look of that old Britisher." "No more do I." "He'll shoot the first thing we know. He's got something mighty juberous in that eye of his." Not another word was said. They wheeled about, made for the road, mounted their horses, and were off. They had been cowed and disarmed by my father's coolness, his independence, by his towering height, and a scorn that was withering to the 2 slave-hunting villains. Part 8. The Flight. The Indian summer had come, the season of seasons, with its golden memories, its diaphanous skies, its dreamlike afternoons, its gossamer veils spread over the shimmering horizon, transforming, by its own transcendent magic, the whole earth and atmosphere. Smoke rose from wooded places in long, thin columns of hazy blue, and once in a while a whiff of burning grass and leaves filled the magnetic air with fragrant odor. The settlers ceased to fret and worry. There was neither reaping nor repining. The sun was setting when I arrived at the load-bearer's home 2 days after Isaac Snedeker's visit to the log house. I had brought more provisions for the fugitives. "Dear me, your ma is good to send all these victuals for the runaways," exclaimed Mrs. Guest, as I emptied my saddlebags on the kitchen table. As I was going to stay there till morning, we sat about here and there waiting for the hours to pass, and the coming of Isaac Snedeker, who was to take the fugitives to the next station that night. We expected his arrival sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock. How calm and peaceful was the evening. Now and then a gentle current of wind stirred the branches, and the leaves fell in flaky showers, like snow on ground already strewn with the dead foliage of autumn. Far away, the tinkling of bells told of cattle peacefully grazing, and the prairie, immense and tranquil as a golden sea, inspired a feeling of ages and ages of repose. In the west, a bank of filmy clouds edged with silver floated against a sky of glassy green, which gradually melted into serried ranks of flaming amber, and the sere, crisp leaves of the beech were interlaced with the red and purple of oak and maple, while the trees by the creek glistened and sparkled in the genial rays of the setting sun. And there was something in the early hours of the evening that throbbed in ceaseless unison with the constellations overhead. After darkness closed in, all the witchery of nature seemed at work in earth and sky. Above the tree-tops, a host of twinkling stars looked down on the anxious watchers and refugees. Presently a thin mist descended about us, through which the starry vault and the dark masses of trees could be discerned, with tracings of dim, fantastic forms in the scattered underbrush. The slanting rays of the rising moon came reaching in long gleams across the roof of the little frame house, while its weird shafts shot through the narrow interspaces of wooden thicket, and gleamed in small round patches on the green moss underneath. The scarlet vines all around on the boughs were tipped with a soft glistening pallor that fell as from some ghostly lantern from a distant world, while just above the horizon, poised like an aerial plume in the deep indigo blue, the vanishing comet waned amidst a wilderness of glittering lights under a shimmering crown of stars. During a moment of profound quiet, when it seemed as if all nature had sunk to rest, a wolf beyond the creek began a series of long, drawn-out howls. The woods began to vibrate with low, clamorous calls. The howling drew nearer. One of the wolfhounds answered back in pitiful cries, then another and another. Everywhere, call answered call. A rushing sound filled the space above us, where vast flocks of wildfowl cut the air with the swish and rustle of 1,000 wings. The honking came and went, as flock after flock passed over us in whizzing waves. The whole world was stirring. Earth sent up a chorus of lamentations that mingled with the voices above. The fugitives huddled together in the cave, in expectation of some unimagined calamity, and at last, unable to withstand the feeling of terror, they began to creep up towards the house. The load-bearer, who had gone into the kitchen, fell on his knees with the Bible open before him on the chair, while his wife sat just inside with her hands tightly clasped, peering intently through the open door across the clear patches of moonlight. Soon he rose and hurriedly walked out. "Where be you goin'?" stammered his wife, noticing his dazed look. He walked as one in a dream, while Cornelia followed. "Elihu, where be you goin'?" There was a clinking of the chains at the kennels, and a cry from the wolfhounds told us they were free. They sped round and round the house in a whirl of excitement, then into the woods, and back again to the house, giving the last shudder to the climax of confusion before they made off towards the main road leading southwest. Then, as by a wave of some invisible wand, the tumult ceased. The woods and the house lay plunged in an all-pervading stillness. The country round about seemed suddenly dipped in a gulf of silence. The load-bearer came back to the kitchen and again fell on his knees. After some moments he began to read aloud. "Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." "Where be they?" mused Cornelia, not listening to her husband. "It's getting late. Brother Snedeker said he'd be here at 10 o'clock. Her hair had fallen down on one side of her face. She looked sad and very troubled. She was overburdened with the loads of others, with loads which she had not sought, which life and death had heaped together in one short, swift period of time, and she felt crushed under their weight. But Elihu Guest, absorbed in prayer, heard nothing, saw nothing, thought of nothing but the eternal. Now he read aloud from Isaiah, "Awake, awake, Jerusalem, which hast drunk of the hand of the Lord the cup of his fury. Thou hast drunken the dregs of the cup of trembling and wrung them out." He remained silent for a moment, and when he continued, it was with a voice full of prophetic faith. "Thus saith the Lord thy God, that pleadeth the cause of his people. Behold, I have taken out of thine hand the cup of trembling, even the dregs of the cup of my fury. Thou shalt no more drink it again." The last words had sunk deep into Cornelia's soul. She seemed to have caught all the mystical power of those 7 magical words. "Thou shalt no more drink it again." Her eyes grew brighter. Her face was lit by a placid smile. All the old religious faith came rushing back. A faint breeze brought with it an aroma of dried leaves and withering grasses. As the moon rose higher in the heavens, the night grew brighter. Not far from the door, a group of fugitives stood gazing intently at Cornelia Guest. The pallid faces of the octoroons forming a sort of spectral frame for the black faces in the center. Here and there around the house, murmurs and half-suppressed groans and supplications arose, for the runaways had brought to the load-bearers' home a new world, with new and unheard-of influences. There were fugitives from nearly every slave state bordering the Mississippi. They brought with them their own peculiar beliefs, their own interpretations of certain signs and sounds of the night. All had been awed by the appearance of the comet, but now a terrible fear possessed them. For each one, every sound came as a special menace. Every object had a special symbol. The load-bearer rose from his knees, and as he stepped to the door, one of the wolfhounds, covered with bloodstains, was there to greet him. The others were not far off, and all had evidently done their work. "Something has happened down on the road," said Cornelia. "They have nipped some evil in the bud," returned Elihu. But Cornelia peered without ceasing in one direction, anxiously awaiting the arrival of Isaac Snedeker. "There's someone a-comin' now," remarked the load-bearer. But we still waited, gazing into the distance. The last hour had seemed endless. We walked down towards the creek to pass away the time, then returned and stood in the moonlight. Elihu Guest was trying to make out what the object was that we now saw approaching from the east. It came looming up in the mist that hung over the road, growing bigger as it drew nearer, and the fugitives, seeing it approach, sought refuge in the darkness behind the house, some running as far as the creek. Not one was visible, not a murmur was to be heard. A ghostly silence greeted Azariah James, the preacher, as he came ambling up on a horse that seemed to glide over the surface of the ground. There he sat for some moments, speechless, and at first I did not recognize him, clad as he was in hunting costume, with a fringe about the cape, a coonskin cap on his head, a rifle slung over his shoulders, and a pistol and dirk before him. But the man himself had not changed. It was the same face, naively absent-minded and wonderingly mute, that I had seen at the meeting-house. The man who began his sermon by a series of blunders, and then glided along by some miraculous means to an unexpected and memorable triumph. Now as then, he looked as if he were floating along with the tide and the hour, ready for the unforeseen without expecting it, armed for trouble without fearing it. We stood looking at the preacher, and he at us, but no one spoke. What an enigmatical group we must have been to the peeping fugitives a little distance away. There sat Azariah James, the preacher, twin brother in spirit to Elihu Guest, the load-bearer. Yet what a contrast they presented. The preacher appeared double his natural size, clothed in a hunter's garb, awaiting some mysterious command. The load-bearer, thinner, smaller, almost wizened, seemed to be waiting some word or sign on the part of the preacher. And a sign did come, but not from Azariah James. Down to the south, through the thick groves of beech, a yellow light rose and fell, and rose again in slow waving flashes over the horizon, its glow reaching above the wooded cover, and even beyond the belted line of timber to the east. "What can that be?" It was Cornelia who spoke, for the two men were still wrapped in a kind of mystical quandary. "There's something going on down there, or my name ain't Elihu Guest, and the Lord ain't set you, Azariah," remarked the load-bearer. "I allow you're right," replied the preacher. "The prairies are burning clear a mile beyond Lem Stevens, plumb to the bend in the creek." "The prairie on fire, and at this time of night? What can it mean?" "Why, it means that the Almighty are with we'uns and against Lem Stevens and the slave catchers," answered Elihu. "Are it running him close?" she asked. "As far as I can judge, it must be closing in on him about now," responded the preacher, with surprising nonchalance. "A passel of good-for-nothings banded themselves together to come over and take off the runaways and get the rewards. They're allowed to be here by this time so as to head off Brother Snedeker. I come right by Lem Stevens's and see him let the bloodhounds loose, and just as the hounds lit out over this way, the prairie began to blaze, so all hands stayed right there to watch the place." The load-bearer began to shake off his seeming lethargy. "Where be the bloodhounds now?" he asked. "Where be they? I reckon they are right where your dogs and my pistol left 'em down the road there." "They are dead!" cried Cornelia. "They are dead!" echoed a mournful voice behind the house. The cry was taken up by other fugitives who imagined Isaac Snedeker and his friends had been assassinated. "They's all dead! They done killed 'em off!" arose on all sides from the dark forms now emerging from their hiding places. An ever-increasing glamour shone through the woods to the south, and the runaways now saw it for the first time. It hushed their cries and murmurs as if a damper had suddenly been placed over their mouths. Azariah James got off his horse, tied up, and followed Cornelia Guest into the kitchen. "Appears like they won't never get here tonight," she sighed. "About how many do you expect?" inquired Azariah. "Brother Snedeker and 2 or 3 more, but he's a-comin' to carry the runaways to the next station. I don't calculate he'll stay more'n long enough to load up and get away as quick as ever he can." There were sounds of horses' hooves and wagon wheels outside. Cornelia Guest went to the door. "Thank the Lord you've got here at last," she exclaimed, greeting a slender man with a long grayish beard, who was helping out an elderly woman clad in deep black. "It's Squire Higgins, and Sister Higgins has come along to cheer a body by that beautiful smile of hers. Elihu always says it's like the grace of God is smiling on the whole world when she's around." And so it was, for Martha Higgins was another of those wonderful women whose very presence diffused an influence of peace and harmony. Her faith and confidence in the divine goodness were incorruptible and never-ending. She brought with her a radiant power that aroused the preacher to thoughts of praise and thanksgiving for all the mercies of the past and present. With her presence, the terrors of the night receded, and the preacher, with his eyes half closed, began to hum a few bars of a favorite hymn. Meanwhile, the load-bearer had quietly slipped away to have a look over the prairie. He climbed a large withered tree which stood on a knoll, and was watching a thin tongue of fire licking up the grass away towards the bend in the creek, not far from Lem Stevens's frame house. From this tree he had often looked out before, but never on such a sight as this. He watched the flames dart up here and there in sudden flashes as they caught the strips of taller grass in the low soil near the water, dying down where the ground was higher and the grass thinner. He could not at first make out in what direction the flames were moving, nor could he yet tell whether they had reached the frame house. The whole region before him lay circled in a rim of fire. Never had he been in such intimate communion with the mighty forces of the eternal. Never had he felt the breath of the night come with so much inspiration and judgment. It seemed to Elihu Guest that the fire had descended from the skies, that a ban had been placed on the movements of evildoers in that section and for miles around, and while he pondered and marveled over the wonders of the night, he felt the living presence throb through his being with a quickening power that lifted him clear above and away from mortal things. He shouted aloud one of his favorite passages from the Old Testament, and was about to descend when a long sheet of flame leaped into the sky. Lem Stevens's house was ablaze. It was burning like a box of tinder. Now the barn caught. Now the brushwood behind the house was blazing. The border of the creek was a mass of flame. It looked as if a fiery serpent were moving in a zigzag along its border, rising and falling on great wings of fire, then disappearing to rise again in another place. A current of wind was created by the heat, and flames darted from the other side of the water. When he returned, Elihu Guest found Isaac Snedeker, who had brought several more refugees with him, the 2 Higgins, Azariah James, and Cornelia, all sitting in a semicircle in the kitchen. And after greeting Mr. Snedeker, he took a seat at one end. There followed a period of deep, devotional quietude, in which each one sat as if alone. There was the gray-bearded Squire Higgins, with his big brows and kindly face. There was Cornelia Guest, slender, frail, and shrunken in her seat. There was Azariah James, whose broodings defied all divination. There was Isaac Snedeker, stern and restless as an eagle about to take wing. And Martha Higgins, whose high, massive forehead and arching nose contrasted strangely with the bountiful kindness of her dreamy eyes, while her smile expressed a faith that was infinite and undying. At one end sat Elihu Guest, obscure carrier of other people's loads, impulsive and enigmatical seer, last in the long procession of the antebellum prophets of old Illinois. A shout was heard, and Elihu looked at Martha Higgins as he said, "They ain't calculated to figure out what it air that's a-working out to save them." "Martha had a presentiment before we came," observed Squire Higgins. "I have never known her to be wrong." "Who lit that fire?" queried Cornelia Guest. "It weren't you, Brother Snedeker?" asked the load-bearer. "That's what I've been wanting to know," he replied. I came near being caught in it, and now I'll have to wait here to see how far it's going to spread." "It is plumb licked up Lem Stevens's house," said the load-bearer. "I see it from the big tree." "I want to know," exclaimed Cornelia. "There ain't nothing left by this time," answered Elihu. "If Lem Stevens and the slave hunters ain't hiding in the water, they are burnt up. There's a mighty power moving over the earth. I ain't seen a night such as this since the comet first appeared." Isaac Snedeker went out with Squire Higgins to survey the land. A wall of fire rose above the creek to the south. An immense palpitating glow lit the sky, a glow that flashed like sheet lightning along the course of the creek, for a wind had risen, which forced the flames straight toward the load-bearer's home. There was a rushing sound where it began to skim the upper branches. Then a current of warm air struck through the open space leading from the creek to the house. The woods rang with the screaming of birds. The howling of a wolf again haunted the lonely plains to the north, and a little later an awful roar told that the fire had reached the tall, thick grass and brushwood that lined the water's edge, not more than a quarter of a mile from the house. "The comet done struck the earth! The world's burning up!" The runaways no longer thought of slave hunters and a return to bondage. For them all was at an end, and from a sort of dumb despair there issued forth groans and exclamations of, "Mercy, Lord! Mercy, mercy!" Yet 2 or 3 were on the point of escaping to the woods. Isaac Snedeker, seeing the danger, called out, "All who run away will be caught." Squire Higgins hardly knew what to do. The night seemed like day. The roar of the fire could be heard ever a little nearer, ever more ominous and awful. "If we have to quit," he said at last, "there's not a moment to lose." He was thinking of the safety of the women. Even the invincible Isaac Snedeker was shaken by the forebodings of evil. But when they returned to the kitchen and beheld the load-bearer in the same place, self-poised, self-contained, all doubts departed. "'Twixt here and there there's a swamp, and a patch o' oak that won't catch, and the grass a sparse and spindlin', and then comes the big trees. But there's something else besides the wind that's blowing them flames, Squire Higgins." Even as he spoke, the light from the fire was gradually descending out of the zenith. Lower and lower it fell. In about 10 minutes, nothing but a dim outline of glimmering yellow could be discerned far beyond the belt of woods, and once more the moonlight reigned. The patches of light were brighter, the shadows deeper. The wings of unrest were folded, and silence returned with a twofold presage. "It are about time," said the load-bearer, rising and placing his hand on the preacher's shoulder. "It are time to begin," he intimated to Squire Higgins and Isaac Snedeker. They all left the kitchen except Cornelia Guest, Martha Higgins, and myself. Cornelia's face assumed a pensive look. She wiped away a tear and said in a quavering voice, "God be praised. He allowed her to pass out of this world in peace. I'm right happy to have you here, Sister Higgins, and I just knowed you'd come over when Elihu sent you word." "I don't know of anything that could have kept me from coming, Sister Guest," replied Mrs. Higgins. "I had a presentiment that she would die right here. We couldn't get her to talk about herself, nor give her name, nor nothing. They're all so afeard they'll be sent back to bondage. There ain't only Mr. Snedeker and Brother James and yourselves as knows about her having died here. If there weren't so many good people around, I'd give right up, seeing so many wicked. But Elihu said he were bound to have prayers and his favorite hymn sung at the funeral." Now for the first time I knew that the quadroon had passed away, and this night was appointed for her burial. We had not long to wait, for presently Squire Higgins came and announced that all was ready. When we got to the graveside near the creek, all the fugitives stood around, some of them holding lanterns, the black faces appearing strangely unnatural in the flickering light, the faces of the quadroons and octoroons more ghostly. Under the trees, half in the moonlight, half in shadow, it seemed as if a great multitude were crowding up from behind, eager to catch every sound that might pass from anyone's lips. A soft breeze moved among the last sere leaves of autumn. Now and then a gentle gust swayed the lower branches to and fro, and an infinitely tender sighing came and went and melted away in the eerie moonlight. The preacher took off his tightly fitting cap, and with it his hair stood out in wild, rumpled locks. He seemed to loom taller and taller. He looked as if he had forgotten all he had intended to say,
and was standing there helpless and forsaken, at the brink of a grave, over the dead he had come to bury. "Praise God," murmured the load-bearer, who alone of all the persons there seemed to understand. Azariah James closed his eyes for 1 or 2 seconds. A slight shiver passed through his frame. Then he opened them wide and searching, and a wondrous light flashed out over the awed and speechless company. He was no longer an awkward, hesitating dreamer, but a lion aroused, a prophet in his own country. His listeners began to move and sway in unison with his immeasurable compassion. And after he had spoken for 10 minutes, the load-bearer offered up a short, fervent prayer. Then, when the last scene was about to begin, the voice of Martha Higgins rang out above the open grave. "On Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and cast a wistful eye." A loud and rolling wave of song passed in long, reaching echoes through the woods as the 29 persons present sent their voices calling, "To Canaan's fair and happy land, where my possessions lie. I am bound for the promised land. I am bound for the promised land." For now, every voice was attuned to the old matchless melody of the meeting house and the campground. As the hymn proceeded, the sense of time was obliterated. A far-sweeping chorus, tinged here and there with a nameless melancholy, floated upward into the white silence of the night. On and on they sang, and the old hymn rolled out in a miracle of sound, on a river of golden melody, vibrating far into regions of infinite light and love. Isaac Snedeker gathered up the runaways and prepared for flight. He separated them into 2 groups. One he would carry in his own wagon. The other was for Squire Higgins. It did not take long, and the 2 wagon loads set out in the clear moonlight. A little way towards the north they would separate, each going according to a prearranged plan. And every fugitive arrived at last, safely in Canada, which was, after all, the land of Canaan for them. This brings to a close our presentation of the Sangamon story. Selected readings from Francis Grierson's The Valley of Shadows. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm Kirk Lawhead, your narrator. If you enjoyed this production, please share it with a friend. For more information, please visit thevalleyofshadows.com. Thank you.